إعلان مهم.
重要提示
Important announcement.
Message important.
Важное объявление.
Anuncio importante.
يرجى من المتحدثين الكرام إلقاء بياناتهم بسرعة معقولة لضمان ترجمة فورية وافية وعالية الجودة.
为了帮助口译准确完整传递发言信息，请代表发言时语速不要过快。
Speakers are kindly reminded to deliver their statements at a reasonable pace to ensure complete and quality interpretation.
Il est rappelé aux orateurs qu'ils doivent présenter leur déclaration à un rythme raisonnable afin de garantir une interprétation complète et de qualité.
Напоминаем ораторам, что для обеспечения полного и качественного устного перевода необходимо выступать в умеренном темпе.
Se ruega a los oradores que pronuncien sus declaraciones a un ritmo razonable para garantizar una interpretación íntegra y de calidad.
Excellencies, dear participants, I hereby declare open the 14th meeting of the 58th session of the Human Rights Council. We continue the general debate under Agenda Item 2. We continue the list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations. The first speaker on my list is Simi. You have the floor.
Senhor Alto Comissário, agradecemos seu incansável apoio aos povos indígenas de Brasil.
Thank you for your tireless support to the people of Brazil. The rights of these people in Brazil are currently being reviewed and bargained in order to attend to private agendas for the exploitation of indigenous territories, especially that of mining. This is happening through a negotiation table in the Supreme Court that claims to agree or try to establish agreements on these rights that should not be altered. This is a seriously insecure time for indigenous peoples. The government cannot continue to demarcate and protect the rights of indigenous territories. In these territories, we're seeing systematic violations and state omissions, as we have seen in the recent armed attacks against the Ava Guarani people and the Guarani Kaiowá people. We appeal to the High Commissioner and the Human Rights Council to bolster and strengthen the obligation of the Brazilian state to guarantee the rights of indigenous peoples. We need to see a re-establishment of the 2023 Supreme Court ruling on the non-constitutional status of the timeframe and to repeal Act 14701.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to International Service for Human Rights. It's a video statement.
50 years ago, the Beijing Conference marked a milestone for feminists globally and in China. For the first time ever, Chinese lesbian activists got a tent during the NGO forum, creating a rare physical space of encounter, resilience, and hope. Yet today, Chinese feminists face harsh and intersecting forms of oppression from a patriarchal society and a repressive state far away from its 1995 commitments. Unable to address this council out of fear of reprisals, this is a message from them. 10 years ago, Chinese authorities detained 5 of us from the feminist movement: Li Maizhe, Wei Tingqing, Wu Rongrong, Chung Chu-run, and Wan Man. Later known as the Feminist Five, they planned to hand out stickers on public transportation on International Women's Day to raise awareness about sexual harassment. At the time, we worried that this was the end of the feminist movement, but we did not give up. Today, more and more women are acting against injustices. We shared our stories about sexual harassment and assault, and this became the Me Too movement. We help each other find safety and support when faced with domestic violence. We help each other face the pressures from a government and society that wants us to give birth to more children and discriminates us in our workplaces. We continue to demand the government release the chained woman, as well as activist He Fangmei and her children, and journalist Sophia Huang Shui-Chin. With all of these actions, the movement has only grown stronger. Today, we celebrate feminism, which makes the world better for everyone, including men living under the patriarchy. We celebrate a just society where everyone can flourish. We believe this is the society that China can become. And today, we celebrate all the actions we will take to make this a reality in the next 10 years.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Villages UNIS.
Mr. President, United Villages appreciates the High Commissioner's efforts in highlighting human rights issues that are closer to our hearts. The statement serves as a beacon of hope amidst the prevailing human rights violations committed by various countries worldwide. Mr. President, it is appalling and regrettable that human rights, which should be the cornerstone of liberal democracies, have been relegated to the background. Populist politics, jingoism, and politics of exclusion and marginalization are further eroding the space for human rights. Kashmir is also a victim of neglect and underreporting when it comes to human rights violations. The people of Kashmir deserve to be heard, listened, consoled, healed, and sympathized with. A human rights violation anywhere is a human rights violation everywhere. We must create a space for Kashmiris to share their stories of agony, pain, and sorrows. We must be empathetic towards the mothers who have lost their sons, shoulder the burden of an old man who has lost his younger son, and support the woman who lives in unending weight and suffocation, unable to express herself due to fear and the absence of human rights. We have promised the world we will ensure human rights. Let us not depress and dishearten the Kashmiri people. They wait for us to provide a remedy. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Stichting Global Human Rights Defense. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Global Human Rights Defense would like to highlight the precarious human rights situation in the state of Bangladesh. Specifically, Hindus, Buddhists, Christians, and indigenous populations continue to face systematic repression, attacks, and whispered persecution. The wave of violence that began amidst the protests in August 2024 has only escalated under the new administration of the interim government, with reports of targeted assaults on religious and ethnic minorities, destruction of property, and desecration of cultural and religious sites. We note with concern that so far state authorities have failed to address and prevent violations of the rights of ethnic and religious minority groups. Global Human Rights Defense further calls for the immediate release of Chimoy Prabhu Das, who is currently arbitrarily detained on sedition charges in the Chittagong Central Jail and whose health conditions continue to deteriorate. In line with the recent report of the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in Bangladesh, we also strongly advocate for a comprehensive reform of the Bangladeshi criminal system so as to guarantee fair trial and due process rights for all without discrimination. We further join the High Commissioner in his call to the interim government to restore civil society and democracy in Bangladesh. Lastly, we urge for justice and accountability to be ensured through national or international tribunals, such as the International Criminal Court. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of iBase.
Senor Presidente,
President, democracy and human rights are at risk. Digital platforms have been instrumentalized by the extreme right to spread hate speech. Far from creating connections, these systems are manipulating entire societies. Major technological platforms that are financially more powerful than many governments operate without any transparency or democratic control. And this leads to mass dissemination of misinformation and attacks on vulnerable groups. High Commissioner reports and the ethical framework of UNESCO have warned against these. In the Global South, we're users and we're merchandise. Our autonomy is threatened. Hate speech online leads to real violence, weakens the social fabric, and puts at risk the safety of millions of persons. We urgently ask for algorithmic transparency with independent audits that reveal how hate speech and disinformation is spread. Effective mechanisms for regulation with penalties for platforms that allow for systematic attacks on human rights. Immediate protection for vulnerable groups with channels for lodging complaints that are accessible and opportunities for a swift response in case of threat. The time to act is now because humanity should not have its future decided upon by algorithms. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Amnesty International.
Mr. Vice President, we thank the High Commissioner for his update and emphasize on the need for all states to shore up support for the UN's human rights pillar as the international human rights architecture faces unprecedented attack. We call on OHCHR to elaborate on how this council could play a role in support and monitoring on the fragile human rights situation in Bangladesh, in addition to the implementation of OHCHR's recent recommendations on Bangladesh, which addressed severe and systematic human rights violations. We call on this Council to continue its support for OHCHR's work on Sri Lanka, particularly in relation to accountability, which is one of the few sources of hope for victims and survivors in their search for justice, given the continuing lack of credible efforts to hold perpetrators of crimes under international law accountable. We welcome the Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan's call for a UN-led independent investigation mechanism with a comprehensive mandate. This Council must act on the urgent need for such a mechanism as it recognized last year. In Sudan, many civilians, including emergency room volunteers playing a crucial humanitarian role, including in Khartoum, are at grave risk of reprisal attacks. RSF's attacks on Zamzam camp and continued siege of El Fasher underscores the urgent need to a countrywide UN arms embargo, real international pressure on the parties to ensure protection of civilians, holding individuals responsible for crimes accountable, and allowing as well as facilitating the urgent delivery of humanitarian aid. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to the representative of Human Rights Watch.
We thank the High Commissioner for his report on Bangladesh. It presents critical evidence of extrajudicial executions, arbitrary arrests and torture by security forces against protesters who were calling for the end to authoritarianism. The crackdown was part of a well-established pattern of abuses by Bangladeshi law enforcement, enabled by a deeply ingrained culture of impunity. Security officers privately told Human Rights Watch that they acted on direct orders from their political bosses, fearing reprisals or seeking rewards. The interim government wants to initiate reforms, but we are already witnessing failures in law enforcement and rising crime. Without urgent structural reforms, the abuses of the past could become a blueprint for Bangladesh's future. Bangladeshis have called for rights-respecting governance. This reform effort by a fragile interim government that is under increasing pressure from various interest groups must be robustly supported by this Council, by donors and civil society. The interim government has welcomed UN assistance. It should urgently initiate a resolution at this council to request continued monitoring and reporting by OHCHR and further independent investigations. We also share the High Commissioner's grave concern at Thai authorities' violation of domestic and international law by forcibly sending at least 40 Uyghur men to China, where they could face torture, enforced disappearances and imprisonment. We urge Thailand as a member of this council to respect its international obligations and the terms of its council membership. The High Commissioner and UN experts should seek access to those returned and independently assess their situation in China. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to CAPLC.
I speak today on behalf of victims of violence committed by the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan, who call all member states to exert pressure to implement fundamental principles of international humanitarian law, including the prohibition of targeting civilians and the protection of essential infrastructures. Provide vital aid to victims and assist neighboring countries hosting Sudanese refugees. Engage a constructive dialogue and contribute to peace efforts. Support investigation conducted by the International Criminal Court. Stop to supply of weapons and support from the United Arab Emirates. The UN fact-finding mission on Sudan has documented extensive killings, torture, rape, and sexual violence. The majority of victims are civilians, over 10 million displaced, and the humanitarian crisis worsening by the day. In January 2024, a UN panel of experts reported credible allegations that the United Arab Emirates had supplied military equipment. The supply of arms, ammunition, and military materials to the RSF by foreign states must cease. The international community cannot turn a blind eye. UN member states must act urgently to protect civilians, address the humanitarian crisis, and contribute to ending the fighting in Sudan. I thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the representative of Madre Inc.
Mr. President and distinguished delegates, good morning. Afghanistan LGBTIQ organization ALO urges this Council to address the dire situation of Afghan LGBTIQ asylum seekers and refugees. Since the Taliban's return to power, Afghan LGBTIQ persons have faced extreme persecution, including arbitrary detention, sexual violence, public floggings, and other torture, acts for which the ICC prosecutor recently requested arrest warrants for Taliban leadership. Those LGBTIQ Afghans who can flee face pushbacks, deportations, and border violence in transit. Those who reach Pakistan, Iran, and Turkey often don't find safety. In those transit countries, Afghan LGBTIQ asylum seekers endure legal limbo, police violence, homophobic and transphobic discrimination, poverty, extortion, and bribery, with many facing deportation back to Afghanistan. Therefore, we urge the international community to establish emergency resettlement programs for Afghan LGBTIQ asylum seekers at heightened risk in transit countries, particularly LGBTQ women and girls and trans men. 2. Provide dedicated funding and resources to refugee-led and LGBTIQ-led Afghan organizations to ensure their meaningful participation in decision-making processes. And 3. Expand access to humanitarian visas and alternative pathways to safety. Thank you for your attention.
Now I give the floor to the International Commission of Jurists.
Mr. Vice President, as OHCHR states, in Tunisia, the authorities have continued to weaponize the judiciary to arbitrarily detain and prosecute dissenting voices, including lawyers. The authorities have also failed to hold accountable officials responsible for unlawful mass expulsion of Black African refugees and migrants, many facing further serious violations, including reportedly mass rapes. We urge Tunisia to immediately take steps to restore the rule of law and judicial independence and to guarantee accountability for victims. The ICJ calls for continued close monitoring of Sri Lanka's dire human rights situation, particularly in the northeast. As the previous administration before it, the new government uses the Prevention of Terrorism Act to arbitrarily detain and target activists. Accountability for past violations remains a dead letter, with domestic mechanisms proving both inadequate and unwilling to address atrocity crimes. Mass grave investigations have been compromised by the recent halt of excavations due to a lack of government funding. In Guatemala, as OHCHR shows, the prosecutor's office has misused criminal law against human rights defenders and independent judges. In light of the fact that the ongoing election process of the next Prosecutor General is politicized and untransparent, the ICJ urges the Guatemalan authorities to take steps to guarantee its integrity and credibility and calls on the international community to monitor the process. I thank you.
Now I give the floor to the representative of East and Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Project.
Merci. Nous remercions.
Thank you. We thank the High Commissioner for his update. We encourage the Office to further build its capacity to identify and respond to early warning signs of crises, including attacks against human rights defenders and civil society. The role of human rights defenders and organisations cannot be overstated, not only for human rights promotion and protection, but also for security and stability, as they are part and parcel of effective alert systems and conflict prevention efforts. Mr. President, we reiterate our call on this Council to address situations based on their merits and objective criteria. Considering the importance of examining civic space indicators to assess country situations and of using civic space restrictions as early warning signs of crises, we raise concern over the suspension of civil society organisations. Prominent human rights NGOs, including CARD, ERCO, EHRDC and LHR in Ethiopia, as well as REDAC in Cameroon, have recently been suspended or resuspended. The vilification of and threats against civic actors such as in Kenya in relation to the finance bill protests in 2024. We express solidarity with HRDs in Eastern DRC. And lastly, in Burundi, we call for the immediate and unconditional release of journalist Sandra Muhoza. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to Sheikh Tahir Azavi Charity Organization. It's a video statement. So we have a technical issue with the video, so we will move on with the speakers list. Now I give the floor to Friends World Committee for consultation.
Thank you, Chair. Recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice and peace in the world. The opening of the UDHR is as true today as when it was agreed. We share the High Commissioner's concern about concerted efforts to undermine the rights of refugees and migrants. We're disturbed by dehumanisation of migrants in narratives and actions that seek to divide us and present people more as a risk than at risk. Dehumanisation is not only a precursor to violence, but undermines that very foundation of freedom, justice and peace. In relation to deaths in migration, the SG has said the scale of this tragedy and the frequency of preventable deaths and disappearances constitute an intolerable and solvable humanitarian crisis. His recommendations, requested by Member States in the IMRF Progress Declaration, include action for accountability, which the High Commissioner said is key, including investigation, monitoring and remedies, and action for prevention, including independent reviews of laws, policies and practices. We believe that the Office and this Council have a role to play and reiterate our call for an independent international monitoring mechanism and our call for a high-level panel on deaths in transit. Migration justice requires not only recognition of our shared dignity, but action to uphold this for all members of our human family. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to Article 19, International Center Against Censorship.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is a joint statement. We thank the High Commissioner for his global update. We encourage the High Commissioner to continue to lend his voice to the cause of Thai civil society for the Thai government to undertake comprehensive constitutional reform. Thailand recently began its 3-year term as a new member of this council. This seat comes with a responsibility to uphold high human rights standards and lead by example. The Thai constitution remains a primary enabler of human rights violations at home. It was drafted and ratified without proper checks and balances, critically undermining democratic processes. The constitution leads to widespread violations of the rights to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly, with broad and vaguely defined restrictions to these rights under the guise of national security and public interests. In particular, Section 112 of the Criminal Code, commonly known as the lèse-majesté law, has been upheld by the Constitutional Court based on language in the Constitution, despite it being fundamentally out of line with international human rights law. We urge the Thai government to drop charges against and release individuals who simply exercise their rights to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly, and to promptly undertake constitutional reform, ensuring that the drafting process of a new constitution is comprehensive and fully aligned with international human rights law and standards. The government should conduct a nationwide election to select the Constitution Drafting Committee and hold open, inclusive and meaningful dialogue and consultation throughout the drafting process, ensuring all voices are heard and considered. Thank you, Mr. President.
Now I give the floor to INHR.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. In considering the High Commissioner's reports on emerging technologies, INHR reinforces our belief that not all states can be AI superpowers, but all states need to be AI governance superpowers. Understanding the risk of AI today is essential for human rights and good governance. This is consistent with the Office's reports that emphasize risk-based human rights assessments. But those reports, like those of other UN agencies, often default to call for a ban on certain technologies without truly understanding them. At INHR, we find the most effective way for states to govern AI systems from a risk-based approach involves 3 simple steps. First, focus on the risks that concern you. Second, understand those risks. And finally, establish appropriate governance frameworks to mitigate those risks. INHR aims to help states govern AI in a safe, inclusive, and rights-respecting manner. Consulting with the best technical experts, we help states understand the risks and give them options for better governance. Our resources include a code of conduct, a guide to AI testing and evaluation, and recommendations to make AI's use in biosecurity safer. Truly understanding AI risks and benefits is the best path for supporting human rights and future governance. For interested states, INHR stands ready to help. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to the representative of Network for Development in Mauritania.
Esteemed members of the Council, first and foremost, we extend our gratitude to the High Commissioner for the comprehensive updates and insight on the global human rights situation. Today we gather to address a pressing concern, the plight of refugees in Africa, which demands our immediate and unwavering attention. The refugee crisis in Africa is particularly alarming, especially for those situated in the conflict zones, such as Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Sahel region, and the population of Sahrawi in Tindouf camps in the southeast of Algeria. Our organization hereby recommends the following actions. Firstly, we urge the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to conduct a comprehensive census of the refugees residing in the Sahrawi refugee camps. This effort will provide essential data to inform and tailor assistance programs effectively. Secondly, we call for immediate measures to enhance the living condition of Sudanese refugees in neighboring countries. It is imperative that these individuals receive adequate shelter, food, healthcare, and education to ensure their dignity and well-being. We also advocate for the recognition and application of the right of return for all African refugees, including those in the Tindouf camps. It is crucial to facilitate their safe and voluntary return to their home countries, ensuring that their rights are respected and upheld. Finally, we call for effective measures to stop the violation of human rights made by the non-state armed groups, especially in the Tindouf camps. In conclusion, we are calling for a technical mission led by the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights in the Sahrawi refugee camp. I thank you for your attention.
Now I give the floor to International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists.
Mr. Vice President, since October 7, 2023, we have seen a global tidal wave of anti-Semitism. This is not just a crisis for Jewish communities. It is a fundamental human rights emergency. When synagogues are set on fire, when Jews are stabbed for their identity, when soccer fans, including children, are assaulted for being Israeli, and when students hide their identity out of fear, we must recognize that the scourge of anti-Semitism, which belongs in the world's dark past, has returned to plague us. This alarming trend has been fueled by the spread of distorted and libelous narratives about the Jewish state of Israel. The tragic irony is that demonstrably false accusations of genocide, ethnic cleansing, deliberate starvation of civilians and the like have been normalized and amplified by the abuse of UN institutions and international legal bodies, the very institutions designed to prevent human rights abuses such as anti-Semitism. We call upon the international community to safeguard the integrity of legal frameworks and UN institutions by preventing their weaponization and misuse. The credibility and effectiveness of our global human rights system depends on it. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada, a video statement.
Mr. President,
This session of the Council occurs amid ongoing wars and threats of aggression, atrocity crimes, environmental catastrophes, and a host of human rights violations. It is unacceptable that some states subordinate international human rights law to their own interests or that of their allies. Some are actively undermining international institutions, including UN bodies and the International Criminal Court. The UN Charter obligates all states to promote universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights insists that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. Yet too many states violate these principles, engaging in vilification, threats, judicial harassment, arbitrary detention, or attacks against judges, prosecutors, lawyers, and human rights defenders who uphold the rule of law. We remind Council members that GA Resolution 60/251 requires them to uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights. Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada calls on all members of this Council to ensure effective, timely measures to uphold the rule of law and to curtail violations. We call on all states to defend international human rights and humanitarian law and to ensure adequate funding to end the Council's liquidity crisis and enable fulfillment of its mandates. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to the Brazilian Institute of Human Rights.
Mr. Vice President, this can happen again, as the High Commissioner rightly warned us. Humankind cannot afford setbacks on the dignity standards developed by the United Nations during the last 80 years. Today, we cannot imagine how planet Earth would look like should states have not resolved to establish the United Nations. Within our human rights constellation, 10 treaty bodies, a myriad of thematic and country procedures, and the Human Rights Council that works year-round through its subsidiary bodies, form part of a protection system that constantly evolves. Along the decades, we tailored a truly global ethos, including its equality component. This is all the more important for those parts of the world not counting on a regional system. We urge this Council to keep supporting the sustainable pursuit of this global project, particularly through regular budgeting of the machinery that works every single day, delivering on the promises of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. We call for courage, compassion, and political will. I thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to CEDSC.
Mr. Vice President, Pakistan has become a global hub for narcotics and human trafficking, with women and children being the most affected. Despite its claims of zero-tolerance policy, Pakistan has failed to curb illegal drug trade and human exploitation, while reports suggest security agencies benefit from these crimes. Narcotics trafficking. Pakistan is a key player in the global drug trade, serving as a major transit route due to its location in the Golden Crescent. The country is involved in heroin, opium, cannabis trafficking, with increasing production of synthetic drugs such as crystal meth and K tablets, drug smuggling routes through Baluchistan, Markan Coast, and Karachi, targeting markets in the Middle East, Europe, and India. Despite 2023 anti-narcotics law, the absence of capital punishment has emboldened drug cartels, while corruption among security agencies allowed the trade to flourish. Human trafficking. Pakistan ranks among the worst offenders in human trafficking, with over 3 million people living in modern slavery. Victims are subject to bonded labor, forced marriages, and sexual exploitation. The U.S. 2024 Trafficking Persons Report confirms that Pakistan fails to meet the global anti-trafficking standards. The global impact. Pakistan's unchecked drug and human trafficking networks pose a grave threat to its own society and international security. Without urgent interventions, these issues will continue to destabilize the region and beyond. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Now I give the floor to MRAP.
I thank you, Mr. Vice President. At a time when international law is under attack, accountability is a cornerstone of the promotion and protection of human rights law and international humanitarian law. We agree that any sustainable solution for peoples who have suffered war crimes and crimes against humanity must be based on accountability, justice, the right to self-determination, and their right and dignity. While many elements constituting genocide can be observed in the occupied Palestinian territory, the crimes that have been committed cannot go unpunished. States that have acceded to the Rome Statute must execute the warrants issued by the International Criminal Court. After 14 years of civil war, the Syrian people aspire to a form of democracy, respect for the rule of law, and the right to self-determination. An inclusive and comprehensive transitional justice process whereby all the crimes committed by the various parties involved will have to be exposed should take place, and everyone will have to account in order to achieve a sustainable solution. In this context, we call upon the Office of the High Commissioner to pay particular attention to the action of the Turkish state, which continues to illegally occupy part of northeast Syria and to carry out a policy of ethnic cleansing and armed actions against the Kurdish civilian population. I thank you for your attention.
Now I give the floor to World Organization Against Torture.
Gracias, señor vicepresidente.
Thank you, Vice President. We're grateful for the reports presented by the OHCHR on Colombia, Guatemala, Honduras. In Colombia, criminalization against human rights defenders and social leaders continues, such as the case of Milena Quiros, an Afro-descendant leader who suffered threats of death, arbitrary detention, stigmatization, and over the past 8 years is facing a prosecution which is trying to criminalize her work of defense. In Guatemala, the national persecution and transnational repression is being promoted by the judiciary against human rights defenders. And we've seen acts of torture again and arbitrary detentions, such as in the case of Virginia La Parra, who was forced into exile in order to ensure the safety of her family. In Honduras, killings and violence against social leaders and human rights defenders is still on the rise without any guarantees of justice or protection. This is the case of Edme Castro, who, in spite of being a beneficiary of the National Protection Mechanism, is continuing to receive threats and harassment. We appeal to states to guarantee the work of human rights defenders, in particular safety and integrity of female human rights defenders and their families. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to Human Rights Research League. A video statement.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Suite au cessez-le-feu entre les...
Thank you, President. Following the ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel that came into power in November 24, the Human Rights Research League has, with concern, seen a transition process to the post-war in Lebanon put in place. The concern of the Lebanese government to bring in Hezbollah guerrillas who are living in grief after the assassination of their leader Hassan Nasrallah and their defeat against Israel leads us to an tacit amnesty for numerous crimes perpetrated by Hezbollah against the Lebanese people and the Lebanese state, also through its allegiance with Iran. But such an amnesty trivializes the violation of human rights, the right of the Lebanese people to truth, justice and reparations against crimes perpetrated against them, and enshrines also a regime of impunity. We call for the members of the Council to remain vigilant with respect to establishing a peace in Lebanon at the cost of impunity. The justice system could contribute to fighting this lethal oblivion and bringing accountability for hatred and destruction, articulated with shoring up the efficient functioning of state institutions, would help create a healthy foundation for the rule of law in Lebanon. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to World Muslim Congress. Microphone, please.
Welcomes the High Commissioner's report and shares the concerns regarding the restrictive laws, harassment and arbitrary detention of journalists and human rights defenders in Indian-occupied Kashmir. However, we are dismayed that the report has not adequately addressed the alarming human rights situation in the region, which continues to deteriorate. I wish to draw your attention to recent tragic incidents in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. On February 6th, a 25-year-old resident, Makandin, from Kathua, tragically took his own life following brutal torture by police and paramilitary forces. In a heartbreaking video recorded prior to his death, he detailed the inhumane treatment he endured and the coercion to accept false charges. On the same day, Wasim Majid Mir, a 35-year-old truck driver from Goripura, Bomai, was fatally shot by Indian forces while traveling from Srinagar to Baramulla. These incidents exemplify the ongoing custodial torture, arbitrary detentions, confiscation of properties, and severe restrictions on religious freedoms faced by the people in Indian-occupied Kashmir. We urge this Council to take immediate actions to address these grave human rights violations and ensure accountability for those responsible. The world should listen to Kashmiri voices rather than listening to political rhetoric of India. I thank you.
Now I give the floor to Women NC Committee for CSW CEDAW. It's a video statement.
President, we are deeply alarmed by the sharp rise in executions in Iran. In 2024, nearly 1,000 people were executed, and in February 2025 alone, 95 executions took place, the highest monthly figure in over 25 years. Last week, a public executions occurred in northern Iran, and this month, 3 women were executed. Iran continues to have the highest execution rate for women globally. We are particularly concerned about more than 50 political prisoners facing executions for nothing more than decent. Among them, Behruz Ehsani, Mehdi Hassani, and 3 women, including Pakshan Azizi, Sharifeh Mohammadi, and Varishi Moradi, have been sentenced to death solely for expressing their political views. Their conviction is blatant violation of fundamental rights. We call an urgent action to halt these executions and uphold injustice and human rights in Iran. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to the representative of Civicus World Alliance for Citizen Participation, a video statement.
Thank you, Mr. President. Civicus and Burma Human Rights Network welcome High Commissioner Ore updates on Myanmar since 2021 coup. The junta has unlawfully killed, tortured, imprisoned activists, journalists, and peaceful protesters. It has carried out widespread atrocity, including airstrike and extrajudicial killing. More than 6,000 civilians have been killed, and at least 20,000 political prisoners remain behind bars. Arbitrary detention of humanitarian workers, lawyers, religious leaders, journalists, and Syrian continue under draconian law. In Rakhine State, 630,000 Rohingya remain trapped under a system of persecution and forced deviation as the Arakan army, now controlling most of the state, continue the junta brutal policy. Despite the effort of Indonesian society calling for accountability of the military forces, criminal acts are ongoing, and junta plan for a sham election represent a blended attempt to entrench military rule. To silence dissent, the junta has ended the SVP cybersecurity law, further restricting fundamental freedom. The council must act to prevent junta use of violence and coercion to force participation in illegitimate election. We urge the Council to adopt a strong and meaningful resolution that protect the human rights of the people, support our effort to build a federal democracy, impede the junta capacity to conduct airstrike and commit further atrocity, and advance accountability through all possible avenues. Finally, we call for the release of unlawfully imprisoned human rights defenders and for granting of public and civil society participation in decision-making, including in election-related laws. We thank you.
Now I give the floor to Al-Haq, Law in the Service of Man, a video statement.
Despite the ceasefire, Israel's genocide in Gaza continues, including killings, buffer zone bombings, and the destruction of UNRWA schools. Essential humanitarian aid and reconstruction material are being impeded. 7 newborn babies have died frozen from hypothermia. Prime Minister Netanyahu is freely crossing the airspace of Rome-statuted parties while advocating for the forcible transfer of millions of Palestinians from Gaza, with full impunity and United States endorsement. Since January 19th, Israel has intensified military operations in the northern West Bank, systematically targeting Palestinian refugees. Israel has outlawed UNRWA, killed 65 Palestinians, and forcibly displaced 40,000 Palestinian refugees. The largest mass displacement displacement since 1967, stating that they will not return. Israel is entrenching its annexationist settler colonial apartheid regime and imposing conditions of life to destroy Palestinians. We call on third states to ensure the full-scale entry of life-saving aid into Gaza, the return of displaced Palestinians, and the release of Palestinian detainees. We call on the International Criminal Court to issue further arrest warrants and expand charges to include settlements, apartheid, and genocide. The root causes must be addressed. The illegal occupation ended by September 2025, and the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people fulfilled.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the representative of RADHEG.
السيد الرئيس، اسمي المعدل كوري لاجئة صحراوية بمخيمات تندوف جنوب الجزائر.
Thank you. Sahrawi refugees in the Tindouf camp need representation, and I stand up before you to bear testimony to the suffering of thousands of Sahrawi, day after day, who have suffered for 50 years. Human rights organizations such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, France Liberté, and others have documented the worst violations of human rights at the hands of the Polisario, militias, and Algerian armed forces, including systematic torture, extrajudiciary executions, rape, slavery, and worse violations of human rights. These have included also the use of weapons. The Algerian forces have caused these violations and allowed. My own father was kidnapped before I was born and tortured to death. Nobody knows what happened to his remains. When I was old enough to ask questions, I myself was persecuted. I never saw my father and never knew his fate. These crimes and practices have taken place with the consent of the Algerian authorities. The Polisario has seen impunity. Interruption.
Representative of Sirac.
Señor Vicepresidente.
Vice President, we're deeply concerned at the human rights situation of children in Africa, in particular in the Tindouf camps, where children are victims of serious violations of their fundamental rights. In these camps, situated in Algerian territory and controlled by the Polisario Front, children are recruited and indoctrinated from an early age into military structures. They're forced to join armed militia, are deprived of their childhood and exposed to hatred and ideology of violence in flagrant violation of international humanitarian law and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We also report on the programme that's called Peace Vacations, which appears to be some kind of humanitarian initiative, but it's turned into a system of sale and trafficking of children. These children are removed from their families without any guarantees of return, and they are instrumentalised to serve the political interests of Algeria and the Polisario Front, used as a tool for propaganda to justify artificial conflict. We urge the Human Rights Council and UN mechanisms to investigate these practices and call on Algeria to take on its responsibility as a sponsoring state, guaranteeing the protection of these children and allowing access to international organisations into these camps. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to the International Bar Association. It's a video statement.
The IBA's Human Rights Institute, the IBAR, is highly concerned about the situation of the Uyghur community in Xinjiang, including the allegations of genocide and crimes against humanity against the ethno-religious minority group, and the ever-growing reports of the use of Uyghur forced labor in the supply chain. The IBAR is highly concerned about reports of countries, including Thailand, deporting Uyghurs to China where they may face mistreatment. More than 2 years after the report of the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, identifying gross human rights violations in Xinjiang that may amount to crimes against humanity, the Human Rights Council failed to discuss its findings and identify adequate responses. As the human rights violations against the community continue, the Joint Committee of Human Rights in the UK Parliament is currently examining the issue of Uyghur forced labour in the supply chain to identify the needed responses and ensure that the consumers in the UK are not complicit in the crimes. This should be done globally as well. The situation of Uyghurs in Xinjiang requires urgent attention from the UN through a truly victim-survivor-centric approach. Thereby calls upon the High Commissioner and this Council to, without any further delay, decide to have an in-depth discussion, session or intersessional debate on the findings of the report and responses needed, continue the ongoing monitoring of and public reporting on the human rights situation in Xinjiang, including the issue of modern-day slavery, ensure that the voices of victims and survivors are heard and they are fully involved in all decisions that concern them. I thank you.
Now I give the floor to the representative of Society for Threatened Peoples.
Thank you, Mr. President. Since July 20, 1999, the government of the People's Republic of China has engaged in systematic persecution to eradicate the Chinese spiritual practice Falun Gong. The then state leader, Jiang Zemin, gave the order to ruin the reputation of Falun Gong practitioners, burn them financially, and destroy them physically. As of December 31, 2024, a total of 1,167 deaths of Falun Gong practitioners have been confirmed and documented in detail. In 2024 alone, there are 164 documented death cases and
we have a point of order from the delegation of China. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, this NGO is abusing the forum of the Council to attack the Chinese leaders and the Chinese ruling party. This violates the rules of procedure of the Council. We'd like to ask the President to stop the right to speak of the speaker.
I also will continue because the Chinese government is spreading disinformation in the human rights.
We say this.
Okay. We are currently holding a general debate on the update provided by the High Commissioner. It is thus expected that participants refer to the High Commissioner's statement. Comments stemming out of his oral update are in order. In this context, speakers may refer to specific situations by way of example. I am therefore giving back the floor to the Speaker, asking him to take my comments into due account. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. In 2024 alone, there are 164 documented death cases and 764 sentenced cases. A typical example is the persecution of Mr. Ding Yuan, for whose immediate release the European Parliament adopted an European Parliament resolution on January 18, 2024. In 2019, the China Tribunal in London concluded that forced organ harvesting had taken place in China for years on a significant scale, with Falun Gong practitioners being the principal counsel of this ongoing crime against humanity. Both the European Parliament resolution and the Falun Gong Protection Act passed by the U.S. Congress aim to impose sanctions on perpetrators of the persecution of Falun Gong. In October 2022, the government of the PRC ordered a new global strategy against Falun Gong, including its information campaigns and a so-called lawfare strategy. We want to call upon the United Nations Human Rights Council to appoint a special rapporteur on forced organ harvesting in China to strongly urge the Chinese government to release Mr. Ding and all Falun Gong practitioners and all other prisoners of conscience, and to investigate China's transnational repression against Falun Gong practitioners and all human rights defenders abroad. Thank you, Mr. President.
Now I give the floor to As-Salam Foundation, a video statement.
Mr. President, we express deep concern over Bahrain's ongoing reprisals against political prisoners in jail prison, violating the Nelson Mandela rules. After political prisoner Hussein Amman died on 5 December 2024, following years of medical neglect, prisoners protested their inhumane conditions. In response, authorities escalated reprisals, subjecting prisoners to beatings, 24-hour handcuffing, solitary confinement, isolation with foreign inmates, medical neglect, denial of religious rights, and deprivation of outdoor time, food, water, showers, clothing, and basic necessities, leading to skin diseases and other serious health issues. One example is Raja'i Ali Baddaw, who is experiencing severe health deterioration, including chest tightness, irregular heartbeat, low blood sugar, and breathing difficulties, yet remains denied urgent medical care. Moreover, prisoners are being denied the right to observe religious rituals, with authorities confiscating their religious texts, including the Quran. In February 2025, many were placed in solitary confinement and barred from family phone calls as punishment for holding religious commemorations. We call on the Council to take urgent action to pressure Bahrain to end these retaliatory measures and adhere to the Nelson Mandela rules. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to Association of Human Rights and Sustainable Development, a video statement.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Nous remercions.
Thank you, President. We thank the High Commissioner for the report on Sri Lanka. However, we are concerned by the lack of justice for the victims of a genocide. The Sri Lankan forces have crushed the Tamils, putting an end to a war with genocide. In 6 months, tens of thousands of Sri Lanka were killed. We call for an international investigation into violations of humanitarian law caused by the Sri Lankan forces. Multiple resolutions have called for an international investigation on the principal crime against the Tamil people. The unitary state system continues to deny the status of the Tamils, our sovereignty and right to self-determination. Even if the new government in place since last November appears to be heroic in its attempt to destroy these people, the genocide has not been completed. There cannot be a political solution without justice for the Tamil people. We call on the co-sponsors of resolutions that have failed to support and protect the Tamils to refer the case of Sri Lanka to the International Court in order to ensure that there are reports and accountability before the international community demilitarizing the west of Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to PDES. It's a video statement.
Mr. President, we wish to express our deep appreciation for the ongoing efforts of the High Commissioner and his office in promoting and protecting human rights worldwide. In this regard, we draw attention to the alarming situation in Tindouf refugee camps, located in the southwestern Algeria, where human rights violations remain a major concern requiring immediate intervention. For nearly 5 decades, thousands of people have been living in these camps under extremely difficult humanitarian conditions, deprived of their fundamental rights. Moreover, the security situation has recently deteriorated significantly, with a rise in criminal acts and violence, further exacerbating the suffering of the inhabitants. We call on the international community to step up its efforts to ensure the full respect of the human rights of the populations living in the Tindouf camps. These efforts must include the provision of humanitarian aid without logistical obstruction from the host country or the Polisario Front, guaranteeing the freedom of movement of the inhabitants, and establishing transparent monitoring mechanisms to track these violations and put an end to impunity. We also stress the urgent need to take decisive action to put an end to these serious violations, secure humanitarian routes, and provide sustainable solutions for the inhabitants. In this regard, we urge the High Commissioner to dispatch a fact-finding mission to closely monitor the situation and provide transparent reports that contribute to the protection of refugees' rights, in accordance with the Geneva Convention on Refugees. Thank you, Mr. President.
Now I give the floor to the representative of the Association of Horus for Youth and Development in Kenya. I don't think they are present here, so we'll move on with the speakers list, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Interfaith International.
Monsieur le Vice-Président, Interfaith International.
Vice President, we thank the High Commission for the remarkable effort despite the budgetary crisis of the UN, as well as the attempts by some states to undermine this council. In this time of polarization, we call for constant support for the Secretariat of the High Commission to maintain dialogue and cooperation in the spirit of Resolution 261 of the Human Rights Council. We have seen multiple crises of international governance, democracy, increasing conflicts, natural disasters, as well as exacerbating of violent extremism in the Sahel region. And more than ever, it is vital that we invest in human rights to maintain a new system of guiding the world. After many years of the existence of this council, men and women still are deprived of justice, living in torture, racism, extrajudicial killings and forced disappearances. With respect to this desperate situation, we call on states to make the fight against violations of human rights a priority. We call on those states to shore up its cooperation with international justice mechanisms. Interfaith International would like to recall to states that human rights are a collective responsibility for all states. They cannot be secondary. It is the responsibility of all to ensure that the values of equality, justice, and dignity prevail in all regions of the world. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to AGIS. They're not here, so we move on to the next speaker, the representative of People for Equality and Relief in Lanka, Inc. They are not here, so we'll move on. Now I'll invite the representative of Jesuit Refugee Services, JRS. So they're absent too, so we'll move on, and I am inviting the representative of Al-Bashir Foundation for Development.
Mr. President, we take this opportunity to highlight the ongoing systematic human rights violations in the occupied territory of Western Sahara. As documented by many human rights organizations, the Moroccan occupation perpetuates a regime of repression, economic marginalization, and severe rights violations while continuing to obstruct independent monitoring mechanisms. The UN Secretary General's report to the General Assembly in July 2024 explicitly recognized the absence of an independent and sustained human rights monitoring, undermining a comprehensive assessment of the situation. The Moroccan government has consistently refused to grant access to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights since 2015. Moreover, MINURSO remains the only contemporary UN peacekeeping mission without a human rights monitoring component, a structural deficiency that perpetuates impunity and reinforces a climate of oppression. Our latest findings reveal an entrenched pattern of arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, torture, and the systematic targeting of the Sahrawi human rights defenders, journalists, and students. Political prisoners, including those from the Gedemizek group, continue to be held under conditions that violate international standards, subjected to the prolonged solitary confinement, medical neglect, and punitive reprisal for their advocacy. Mr. Vice President, these violations persist due to the international community's failure to ensure accountability. We reiterate our call for the establishment of an independent UN-led human rights monitoring mechanism for Western Sahara and urge full and unfettered access for OHCHR and other relevant bodies. We emphasize the UN's responsibility to uphold the Sahrawi people's inalienable right to self-determination, ensuring that international law is respected.
Now I give the floor to the representative of Africa Culture International.
Monsieur le Vice-Président.
Vice President, Africa Culture International expresses its deep concern at the persistent violations of children's rights in Africa, and particularly in the DRC, Sudan, and in the Tindouf camps. In the DRC, thousands of children are victims of forced recruitment by armed groups. They're taken from their families, used as combatants, messengers, or sexual slaves. In Sudan, the situation is just as alarming. Since the outbreak of the conflict in 2023, many children have been killed, injured, or displaced, and this humanitarian crisis is affecting over 14 million children, according to the UN reports. In the Tindouf camps, controlled by the armed group, the Polisario Front, with the support of Algeria, the rights of children are seriously flouted. Children are submitted to ideological indoctrination from the youngest age, and many are sent to Europe under the Peace Vacations program. Behind this humanitarian facade, children are often trafficked, separated from their families, and used as political propaganda. We urge the states concerned to guarantee humanitarian access, to halt the exploitation of children, and to ensure their right to a protected childhood free of any violence and political manipulation. I thank you.
Now I give the floor to the representative of in Senakolo.
My name is Fadel Braka. I'm a former Sahrawi prisoner in in the southern of Algeria. These Sahrawi refugees are suffering in Tindouf camps for 50 years, suffering from worst violations by the Polisario leadership. This includes extrajudicial killing and forced disappearances, recruitment of children, as well as rape. And there is also restriction of movement inside the camps. In addition to the practices of the Algerian authorities in terms of racial discrimination against the Sahrawis, the latest episode of these practices is the barbaric attack against the Sahrawi schoolgirls by the Algerian authorities after they demanded an end of ethnic discrimination they suffer from in the Al Buyud secondary school in the wilaya of Mishriya. These attacks resulted in the fall of many victims. Their guardians were not allowed to leave the camps to see them in hospitals. They are also subject to psychological and physical assaults after they showed pictures of the seriousness of their injuries, and would like to draw your attention to the worsening of the siege imposed on the Tindouf camps after the Algerian authorities last month decided to limit the number of vehicles allowed to leave the camps every year by 90 vehicles every week. And the Algerian army has also resorted to the chair interrupts.
Representative of Association Hastiware. It's a video statement.
President, distinguished delegates, today we raise the voices of hundreds of thousands of concerned citizens on behalf of over 1 million Christians in or from Syria who have faced persecution, violence and forced displacement. Despite some international efforts, the situation continues to deteriorate. Churches have been attacked, religious symbols desecrated, and Christian communities forced to flee due to growing fears of violence. Syrian Christians, one of the world's oldest Christian communities, are once again at risk of persecution, displacement, and erasure. We are discussing about the same Syria where just 10 years ago, ISIS nearly wiped out entire Christian communities, burning churches and inflicting untold suffering on families simply for their faith. We therefore call on the international community to take urgent action to ensure the security and fundamental rights of Christians in Syria. We demand international investigations into the violence and persecution targeting Christians in Syria, ensuring that those responsible are held accountable. We ask you to ensure the plight of Syrian Christians is fully recognised in international aid efforts so they receive protection and assistance they are entitled to. We ask that you strengthen international justice mechanisms to ensure that the perpetrators do not escape impunity.
Excellencies, distinguished participants, this was the last intervention we could accommodate at this session. We are sorry about it because of the paucity of time. Thus, we have concluded the general debate on item 2. We shall now continue to hear statements in exercise of the right of reply pertaining to the general debate under agenda item 2. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of India. You have 3 minutes.
Mr. Vice President, we are constrained to take the floor to exercise our right of reply against the malicious and motivated remarks made by Pakistan and the OIC. While it is laughable that a country with a human rights record as abysmal as that of Pakistan continues its obsession of spreading lies about India, it is even more unfortunate to see that the OIC has also once again allowed itself to be used as a mouthpiece for Pakistan's anti-India propaganda. Mr. Vice President, not only are the entire territories of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh an integral and inalienable part of India, but more importantly, the last few years have ensured that their people have fully joined their fellow Indian citizens to become an equal beneficiary and partner of India's growth story, powered by democracy, diversity, and development. The enthusiastic participation in the recent Legislative Assembly and provincial elections in Jammu and Kashmir makes clear the strong foundations of constitutionalism and the faith that people have in them. And the economic progress is for everyone to see. Mr. Vice President, it is unfortunate that this Council's time continues to be wasted by Pakistan, and we do not wish to dignify this farce any further. I thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. In response to the statement by Denmark on behalf of 25 EU member states, we reiterate that exercise of human rights and fundamental freedoms is permissible within national laws. Whatever goes beyond that is subject to corresponding judicial process. The ongoing violations of refugees and migrants' rights in Switzerland is alarming. We call on the authorities to redress the situation and guarantee protection of their rights. As regards the false and groundless allegations by Armenia, firstly, references by the delegation of Armenia to the Karabakh region of Azerbaijan under fake name is an illustration of disrespect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of my country. Secondly, what the delegation of Armenia falsely referred to as forcibly deportation and ethnic cleansing of Armenian residents of Karabakh was a voluntary departure. It was their free choice, although Azerbaijan encouraged them to stay. Armenia's groundless allegations to the contrary had been refuted by the reports of the UN interagency team that visited the Karabakh region 3 times and by the statements of the UNHCR office in Armenia. The decision of Armenian residents to relocate was a result of a systematic campaign by the former unlawful puppet regime installed by Armenia in the Karabakh region to spread among Armenian residents hatred towards Azerbaijan and Azerbaijanis. Hundreds of local Armenians attested publicly that they had not been pressured to leave Azerbaijan. At the same time, they also confirmed that the leaders of the unlawful puppet regime had directed them to live in a language designed to inspire fear and hatred. Azerbaijan at the highest level publicly guaranteed that eligible residents who decided to leave have a right to return. Thirdly, delegation of Armenia deliberately omits mentioning the proceedings instituted by Azerbaijan against Armenia in the ICJ under the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, as well as the provisional measures delivered by the court in its order of 7 December 2021 in respect of Armenia. Thus, the court ordered that Armenia shall, in accordance with its obligations under CERT, take all necessary measures to prevent the incitement and promotion of racial hatred, including by organization and private persons in its territory targeted at persons of Azerbaijani national or ethnic origin. Regrettably, Armenia doesn't implement the order of the court. Fourthly, Armenia has not taken any step to prosecute perpetrators of ethnic cleansings and other mass atrocities committed in the course of its military aggression and occupation of Azerbaijani territories. Azerbaijan has taken concrete steps to prosecute them in full accordance with the international standards of administering justice. Not only is it the right of Azerbaijan, but also its obligation under international law. Thank you.
Thank you, Azerbaijan. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of United Arab Emirates. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, my delegation would like to exercise the right of reply as to the accusations leveled by the representative of the Sudanese armed forces. We regret the repeated attempts to level accusations that are baseless. It is reprehensible that in his talk or address he is denying any link between Burhan and the Sudanese armed forces. The Sudanese armed forces are party to the conflict in Sudan now. And it is the role of the government to exercise mediation without being biased to any party, instead of being involved in mediation. The Sudanese armed forces is undermining the political process that would lead to a transitional civilian government that is non-partisan, that meets the aspirations of the Sudanese people towards stability and development. Vice President, what was said is baseless accusations from Sudanese officials in order to evade legal responsibilities. There are violations of human rights and a humanitarian crisis caused by the conflict. It is absurd that warring parties, including the Sudanese armed forces, to undermine the delivery of humanitarian assistance. And the UAE reiterates that it has never been a party, or it is not biased to any party to the conflict. We would like to recall that our documented letters to the Security Council refute these baseless allegations completely, and they are evidence-based. In closing, Vice President, the UAE seeks to end this conflict. We call for the respect of the sovereignty of Sudan. Thank you, Vice President.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sudan.
Shukran. Thank you, Vice President. I would like to deliver this statement to exercise the right of reply as to the statement of the representative of the UAE under item 2 vis-à-vis the participation of his country in a conference that was organized last February. Humanitarian action, Vice President, is a great message, a noble message governed by basic principles such as humanity, neutrality, and independence. The hand that provides weapons to unbridled militias that exercise all violations amounting to genocide cannot present itself as if it is rendering humanitarian support to the same affected people that it contributed to their suffering. Our allegations are evidence-based. We have referred to the support that was also reflected in the UN team that was established as per Resolution 1518, which is an official document of the United Nations. It was there are also many other reports that were drafted by human rights organizations. Second, we would like to recall the principles of the Charter and international humanitarian law, including sovereignty and non-interference in internal affairs. We also remind them of using the official languages in the United Nations documents. The Sudanese Armed Forces is one of the Sudanese state institutions, and our law in Sudan mandates these forces to exercise responsibilities at the time of transition. This is part of our constitutional document. As to the allegations by Egypt Peace for Human Rights Organization against the Sudanese Armed Forces, I think this organization also adopts the same claims of the militias and its representative in this council. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iraq.
Thank you, Vice President. We exercise the right of reply as to Ireland's statement at the general debate under item 2. Vice President, applicable laws define death penalty for serious crimes, especially those linked to terrorism, claiming the lives of millions of Iraqi civilians. Iraq is facing continued terrorist threats, and the death penalty is part of legal deterrence to protect society and to ensure stability and safety. Proceedings take a long time to ensure justice and respect of the rights of those accused, proceeding from the time of arrest until the end of proceedings. And the Iraqi legal system is committed to international standards in investigation and prosecution. Vice President, Iraq is committed to non-interference in the internal affairs or the domestic affairs of other states, and we call on Ireland to focus on putting an end to violations suffered that the migrants and asylum seekers are suffering from, especially racism and discrimination in workplace and in accommodation. Iraq reiterates that pushing for the end of the death penalty without paying heed to the sovereign right of countries to take necessary measures to protect the fabrics of the state and its citizens would lead to arbitration and repetition of tragedies. Thank you, Vice President.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Mr. Vice President, we categorically reject all the provocative and baseless allegations against Turkey. Turkey reiterates that the only occupation in Cyprus is the occupation of the seat of the government of the once Partnership Republic of Cyprus by the Greek Cypriot side through force of arms. Contrary to the misleading allegations, had the Cyprus issue started in 1974, I would like to ask them why the United Nations peacekeeping force, UNFICYP, was deployed in the island in 1964. Between 1963 and 74, the Turkish Cypriots were subjected to an ethnic cleansing campaign by the Greek Cypriots, and they were forced to live in enclaves, comprising only 3% of the total area of the island. It should be remembered that the inhuman living conditions imposed on the Turkish Cypriot people were described as a veritable siege by the then United Nations Secretary General in his report of 10 September 1964 to the Security Council. During those darkest days in the history of the Turkish Cypriot people, hundreds of Turkish Cypriots have been killed, injured, and maimed by the Greek Cypriot militia, or forcefully abducted, never to be seen or heard again. In 1974, when Greece and its collaborator, Greek Cypriots, made a final attempt in the wake of a coup d'etat for the total extermination of the Turkish Cypriot people in the island, with the ultimate aim of enosis, that is to say, to annex the island to Greece. Turkey's timely intervention in accordance with her rights and obligations under the 1960 Treaty of Guarantee saved the lives of Turkish Cypriots and prevented the illegal annexation of the island to Greece. The Turkish peace operation also saved the lives of the Greek Cypriots in 1974. The legality of the Turkish intervention of 1974 has been underlined by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in its resolution 573, adopted in 1974. Furthermore, the Athens Court of Appeal, in its decision of 21st of March 1979, decision number 2658/79, underlined that, in quotes, the Turkish military intervention in Cyprus, which was carried out in accordance with the Zurich and London agreements, was legal. Turkey, as one of the guarantor powers, had the right to fulfill her obligations. The real culprits are Greek officers who engineered and staged a coup and prepared the condition for this intervention. Moreover, it is very important to recall the dramatic statement made before the Security Council on 19 July 1974 by Archbishop Makarios, the Greek Cypriot leader at that time, in which he openly accused Greece, not Turkey, of invading and occupying Cyprus. I would like to remind that the presence of Turkish peace forces prevents...
Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. We exercise the right to reply because of the comments from Denmark representing the European Union, as well as the Netherlands and the United Kingdom. It seems to me that the European Union would have more relevant things to look at. It seems instead they continue to meddle in the sovereign affairs of other states. The European Union needs to look at coherence in terms of international policy. It's laughable that for the European Union, Nicolas Maduro, who participated in and won an electoral process, but San Juan Maduro did not take part in any electoral process and decided to self-proclaim the winner without any electoral process, and that was acceptable. You might recall, European Union and the United Kingdom, that you recognise this person with great aplomb. You have to look at concepts of democracy. Perhaps it might seem that your countries with the monarchy systems are not quite understanding the idea of democracy. Let's talk about human rights within the European Union and the United Kingdom, that is, instead of looking at putting an end to the war in Ukraine, is looking at tackling Russia. We need to try to put an end to war in Europe. As Alfred Saya said, the greatest barrier to peace is the combination of ignorance and arrogance. End of quote. Talking about human rights, let's the European Union and United Kingdom have been complicit in the extermination of the Palestinian people. The European Union have transformed the Mediterranean into a cemetery of our migrant African brothers. You call for financing from the United States and you make this a bargaining chip, as we have seen recently. We understand the reason for your statement in the Council, giving the dose of reality that you received in the context of the new geopolitical reality. We, of course, need to have an independent, coherent European Union that has personality in the international scene and not some kind of mockery that we've seen on the basis of decisions that are being taken within the United States. Thank you very much, President.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Armenia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We take the floor to firmly reject Azerbaijan's continued attempts to distort the facts and evade responsibility for human rights violations and breaches of international law. As we speak, Azerbaijan continues to weaponize the justice system for dehumanizing and prosecuting Armenian prisoners of war, hostages, and other detainees who are subjected to staged trials which are being conducted with gross procedural violations, clear signs of torture, and use of coercion. Armenian prisoners of war, hostages, and other detainees are being unlawfully held in Azerbaijan in blatant disregard of its commitments and international obligations, including UDHR, ICCPR, the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, and Degrading Treatment, and European Convention on European Human Rights. During these days in 1988, from February 27 to 29, a series of atrocities were carried out in Azerbaijan's city of Sumgait, which marked the beginning of large-scale massacres against Armenians in that country, openly orchestrated and sponsored by the state, turning decades of pressure and persecution into overt and widespread violence. The mass murders and torture of citizens of Armenian origin in Sumgait continued with the same patterns and horrifying brutality in Baku, Kirovabad, and Maraga. The issue of mine contamination in Nagorno-Karabakh originates from the first Nagorno-Karabakh war, during which all parties to the conflict were engaged in planting of USSR-era mines. Following the 1994 ceasefire, significant areas of Nagorno-Karabakh and surrounding territories remained heavily contaminated with landmines and unexploded ordnance, causing tragic fatal accidents among the population of Nagorno-Karabakh. The situation has been exacerbated by Azerbaijan's unwillingness to cooperate or provide any information about the minefield maps, leaving thousands of mines undetected. The international community must not turn blind eye to these violations. It is the collective responsibility of international community to ensure that international human rights law and humanitarian law are upheld and protected everywhere. We are convinced that overcoming enmity is crucial for preventing the recurrence of such tragedies in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Mr. Vice President, the UK, Canada, Australia, Japan, and some anti-China NGOs have abused the platform of this Council to fabricate and spread false information in an attempt to smear and accuse China. China strongly opposes and firmly rejects their allegations. China's national policy on ethnic groups is based on equality and unity and the protection of fundamental rights and freedoms of all people. At the same time, illegal and criminal acts are dealt with in accordance with law. At present, Xinjiang, Tibet are enjoying remarkable economic growth and social stability. Various rights such as religious freedom and the freedom to use and develop one's own languages are fully guaranteed. In Hong Kong, since the implementation of the national security law, stability has returned to the city. All statutory rights are guaranteed. As for the 40 illegal migrants of Chinese origin who were repatriated from Thailand, their legitimate rights and interests were fully protected. They have all returned home after relevant legal procedures. The local government is working with their relatives to assist their early reintegration into the society. This repatriation is part of a normal law enforcement cooperation between China and Thailand, which is internationally law-based and is in line with the international practice. As for the so-called assessment report on Xinjiang, China has repeatedly stated its solemn position. This report in question has no legal authority, no consent from the countries concerned, no factual basis, is completely illegal and invalid. The Council has already firmly rejected the draft decision on Xinjiang at its 51st session. Nearly 100 countries have continuously supported China through their joint statements, showing their support for China. Some countries continue to fabricate lies and rumors and attack and smear China, but they remain silent about the sufferings of the Palestinian people and the protracted problems of gun violence, drug abuse, and racial discrimination. They use human rights as a banner to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, to impose UCM, violating the human rights of developing countries. China would like to advise these countries to engage in self-reflection, to take practical actions to fulfill the original mission of the Council, and to do something practical to promote the healthy development of the international human rights cause. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Mr. Vice President, Indonesia takes this opportunity to exercise its right of reply to remarks made by an NGO regarding its concern on potential human rights challenges in sustainable clean energy development in Flores, Indonesia. The government of Indonesia reaffirms its commitment to ensuring that all development projects, including the geothermal project in Flores, are implemented in full respect of human rights and in accordance with national legal provisions. We acknowledge the concerns raised regarding the potential social and environmental impacts of this project. We wish to emphasize that policy implementation on the ground aims to ensure fair and equitable development for the local communities. The geothermal project is not only part of Indonesia's broader clean energy transition, but also directly supports the energy needs of local communities. As part of this effort, the government is committed for continued dialogue with all stakeholders, including the local communities, to ensure that their voices are heard and considered at every stage of the project. In terms of environmental protection, we have mechanisms in place to monitor operations and receive reports on companies' non-compliance with national environmental quality standards. We believe that active engagement with all stakeholders is essential to achieving a balanced approach that safeguards both development needs and the protection of human rights. Furthermore, Indonesia has taken concrete steps to mainstream business and human rights through a flagship initiative, the establishment of a web-based application, Prisma, in 2021. This platform allows businesses to better understand and apply human rights principles in their operations. We hope that this initiative will effectively address gaps in knowledge and awareness regarding business and human rights, ensuring that the private sector fulfills its responsibility to respect human rights. The government of Indonesia assures that the priority for development in the eastern part of the country is aimed at ensuring inclusive growth and realizing human rights, including the right to development. Balancing sustainable development with human rights protections requires a holistic approach and strong multi-stakeholder collaboration. The government welcomes constructive support from NGOs, particularly in facilitating communication with local communities, ensuring that all voices are heard, and helping to bridge any gaps between policy and implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Islamic Republic of Iran.
Mr. Vice President, my delegation exercised this right of reply to answer some accusation leveled against my country, mainly on issue of execution. Answering this claim, we mentioned some key points. First, most executions in Iran are related on drug issue. Iran is located in a very sensitive geographical situation in our region. being in the transition path of the drug smuggling from Afghanistan to other parts of the world. Only in 2024, Iranian anti-narcotic policies 239,328 kilogram drug eastern border. It is very serious in the national combat against drug. This fight is not only for our youth population, but for the youth people of other countries that these drugs are directed to. Iran has lost 4,000 of its police officers in the battle that should be considered and appreciated. We are serious in the issue and we remain determined in this path. But at the same time, we are ready to hear from other delegations about the way to prevent people resorting to drug smuggling and an alternative to reduce the execution. Second, unilateral coercive measure is one of the important causes for our economic difficulties that make people poorer and force them resorting to drug smuggling. If Western countries like Iran and Australia are really worried on our execution, show me willingness in removing its causes. Third, Iran is a just exercise execution on serious crime and it's totally on the country's sovereignty to determine which crimes are serious. I thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative. Yeah, it's the representative of Thailand. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thailand wishes to exercise our rights of reply in response to civil society organizations as follows. As a party to the ICCPR, Thailand reiterates its commitment under international obligation to protect human rights and assure its citizens enjoy their rights to freedom of expression and of peaceful assembly. These rights are guaranteed by the Thai Constitution and include participations in public affairs and discussions and debates about various issues, so long as exercise of such rights is within the bounds of the law. The rights to freedom of expression also carries with it duties and responsibilities, particularly in relation to the reputation of others and to the protection of public order and national security, as stipulated in Article 19(3) of the ICCPR. In addition, Article 21 of the ICCPR provides for situations where restriction may be placed on the exercise of the right to freedom of peaceful assembly, in particular in relation to national security, public safety, public order, the protection of public health or morals. Thailand continues its efforts to find a right balance with regards to these rights. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Mr. Vice President, truth has an invincible trait of surfacing. No matter how hard you try to bury it through the use of brute force, no matter how hard you smother it under the thick fog of disinformation, no matter how brutal you crack down on dissenting voices, no matter how vociferous the clamor of your propaganda, the truth about the oppressed Kashmiris has always surfaced, whether in the reports of the special procedures, OHCHR, or the comments by the High Commissioner and the UN Secretary General. Mr. Vice President, by imprisoning the majority of Kashmir's leadership and arbitrarily detaining thousands, the occupation regime incessantly peddles the false narrative of development and normalcy in the region. I would draw the attention of the Council towards the persistent violations of the international law in the occupied territory that continue at an industrial scale with impunity. Mr. Vice President, continual denial of the right to self-determination is a violation. Dehumanization campaigns are a violation. Demographic engineering is a violation. Use of pellet guns is a violation. Draconian laws enabling torture, arbitrary arrests, and enforced disappearances are a violation. Summary executions are a violation. Confiscation of properties and destructions of houses are a violation. But above all, deploying hundreds of thousands of troops to occupy a disputed territory and oppressing the hapless Kashmiris is a grave crime. The occupying regime needs to realize that such brutal measures only provide an added fillip to the just struggle of the Kashmiris in their right to self-determination. Mr. Vice President, their efforts to mislead state delegations, pressurize independent observers, and to coerce the civil society have always failed and will keep failing. The reality they speak of is a reality they desperately wish to bury, and this too shall fail. I thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Monsieur le Président.
President, we would like to offer reactions to some unjustified statements about the freedom of the press in our country. The evolution of the press landscape has benefited from freedom without any advanced censor. Up to 2024, 150 electronic journals and many television channels have been created. Many other media outlets have been created also, and constitutional and legislative provisions, including decriminalizing the freedom of the press, after the 2020 constitutional law have been passed. We have also seen the new right to create newspapers by a simple declaration. There is no framework for deprivation of freedom of bloggers, journalists, or independent media based on the content of their written, audiovisual, or digital content. In social media, there has been freedom under customary law. There have been no legal procedures against journalists. We remind the Swiss delegation that Switzerland itself should allow free assembly before accusing others. We have seen problems in this area. As a co-sponsor on the resolution on freedom of assembly, Switzerland must guarantee the protection of the right of all protesters to express their opinions, including students who have often been threatened and intimidated when protesting on behalf of the Palestinian people in Switzerland. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Greece exercises its right of reply to the statement made by the representative of Turkey. We categorically reject all claims, accusations and false allegations made by Turkey. Regarding the Cyprus issue, we need to remember that it remains, first and foremost, a question of illegal invasion and occupation. The illegal Turkish invasion of 1974, which resulted in the death and disappearance of thousands of Greek Cypriot civilians and the displacement of hundreds of thousands, violated and continues to violate the most fundamental rules and principles of the international law, as well as the 1960 Treaty of Guarantee, which binds Turkey to respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the Republic of Cyprus. The two-phase Turkish invasion of July-August 1974 has resulted in the continuing illegal occupation of one-third of the island and the displacement of the vast majority of the Greek Cypriot population from their ancestral homes in the area under Turkish military control. The only way to the ending of human rights violations in Cyprus is equally well known. It is the resumption of negotiations leading to a mutually acceptable comprehensive Cyprus settlement, which can only be achieved based on the one and only agreed upon negotiating framework which has been established by the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. The rights of all Cypriots will be best safeguarded through the termination of the Turkish occupation and the finding of a solution within the above-mentioned framework of the UN Security Council resolutions. Thank you.
I understand that the distinguished representative of Azerbaijan has requested for a second right of reply. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We exercise our right of second reply to reject all the allegations by Armenia as false and groundless. Western Azerbaijanis were subjected to ethnic cleansing and forcibly expelled from their historical homeland, from the territory of present-day Armenia in stages. During 1987 and 1991 alone, close to 300,000 Azerbaijanis were expelled from their ancestral lands and sought refuge in Azerbaijan. Armenia had destroyed the Azerbaijani cultural heritage, including historical sites, mosques and settlements. As a result of such ethnic cleansing, not a single Azerbaijani remained in Armenia, which became a mono-ethnic state. Armenia is trying to deliberately portray the activities of the Western Azerbaijan community as a threat to its territorial integrity. However, the goal of the community is to facilitate a peaceful, safe and dignified return of Azerbaijani population to their ancestral lands. We call on Armenia to restore the fundamental rights of the expelled Azerbaijani population. Mines planted by Armenia in the formerly occupied territories of Azerbaijan is one of the serious consequences of the military aggression that had been unleashed against my country. The failure by Armenia to provide full information on the locations of landmines after the end of the conflict is a violation of international human rights law. We call on Armenia to provide full and accurate maps of minefields. Thank you.
I understand Armenia has requested for the floor. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I would like to exercise my right of reply in order to reject the fabrications put forward by Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan has created the narrative according to which Armenia purportedly plants landmines against the civilian population. Azerbaijan itself is not a member to the Anti-Personnel Landmine Convention. This fact alone hardly gives it the right to preach others for compliance. From 1994 to 2020, Azerbaijan not merely categorically rejected any cooperation on humanitarian demining in and around Nagorno-Karabakh and on its borders with Armenia, but actively hindered any international efforts in this regard. As a result of such obstructionist policy, the HALO Trust, international organization financed by foreign governments, including US, was not able to engage in demining activities in the adjacent territories of Nagorno-Karabakh. Similarly, in 2016, Azerbaijan initiated and effectively shut down OSCE Yerevan office, alleging the latter of assisting Armenian authorities in humanitarian demining projects in the region. Azerbaijan has never, ever provided minefield maps to Armenia, neither before the 2020 war nor afterwards. Despite the absence of such commitments, Armenia has unilaterally transmitted to Azerbaijan all the minefield maps under its possession as a goodwill humanitarian gesture. It is regrettable that Azerbaijan, who did not provide any single landmine map to Armenia, continues to accuse Armenia on alleged inaccuracies of those maps. Armenia's transparency in this matter reflects its commitment to addressing these issues constructively, in contrast to Azerbaijan's unfounded allegations. Regrettably, the efforts of Azerbaijan wrapped into the noble cause of mine action serve the purpose of advancing Azerbaijan's distorted narratives at the expense of genuine humanitarian objectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Armenia. I understand the distinguished delegate of Bangladesh has asked for the floor in exercise of right of reply. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I have the honor to exercise our right to reply in response to the allegations raised by an NGO on minority issue. The post-5th August violence in Bangladesh was rooted in political and personal factors, not sectarian. The violence affected people mostly with partisan political affiliations, almost all of them being Muslims and only a few from other religious minority groups. There was no systematic attack on minorities, as also vividly described by the OSCHR fact-finding report. Rather, following the mass uprising in July-August, the world has witnessed how the entire society of Bangladesh came forward to protect its minority, following our long tradition of communal harmony. Unfortunately, when the people of Bangladesh were setting glorious examples of religious harmony, We observed a flurry of exaggerated, unfounded, and fake reports and deliberate spread of misinformation and disinformation by vested quarters regarding minority persecution. Our chief advisor's press wing recently debunked the false allegation of minority persecutions, backed by information received as a result of thorough investigation into the allegations raised by some quarters. As also unequivocally stated by our Honorable Chief Advisor, our government is committed to ensuring the rights of all, irrespective of their ethnicity, gender, or religious belief, as the equal citizen of the country. I thank you, Mr. President.
Please bear with us for a moment.
Some, including a few states and non-governmental organisations, even fellow experts, have appealed to me not to mention specific countries or situations, have criticised the timing of my report, or have attempted to obstruct me from speaking out about hostages. Some have even accused me of bias for raising the plight of individuals taken against their will who became bargaining chips in political or financial transactions that they have little or nothing to do with. Yet right now, people of many nationalities, most of them civilians, are being held against their will without access to international observers or consular officials. This report should be welcomed by anyone who believes in human rights for all, who supports an international legal system that does not discriminate between victims, and who seeks to end torture. Hostage-taking is perpetrated by states. It is also perpetrated by non-state actors. I have heard horrifying stories from victims about how they were seized without warning before being held in prisons and other hellholes in jungles, basements, and tunnels. How they were kept captive without proper judicial charges or procedures. What is particularly deplorable is the ways in which hostages are deliberately mistreated as part of perpetrated strategies to secure better concessions. That type of manipulation is unconscionable. As this Council's appointed independent expert on the prohibition on torture, I remind you of your international obligations, that torture is always prohibited. If you are unable to stand up for all hostages, you have no right to speak about human rights in this Council. You must do more to root out this evil. Distinguished delegates, history is littered with examples of hostage-taking. Recently, it has changed dramatically into a cynical, pseudo-diplomatic tool used by a small number of states who detain foreign nationals on fabricated or highly inflated charges to extract confessions from their states. These are not prosecutions on legitimate criminal charges. This is the targeting of foreign or dual nationals to blackmail their country of nationality. My report documents cases in China, Iran, Myanmar, North Korea, Russia, the United Arab Emirates and Venezuela. There are no official statistics for hostage-taking incidents. Hostage International informs that they have helped more than 500 people affected by hostage-taking and arbitrary detention over the past 2 decades. At the end of 2023, Hostage Aid Worldwide reported that there were people of 53 different nationalities being held hostage or arbitrarily detained globally. In the research for this report, it was clear that the scale is much larger and the geographical spread much wider than these statistics indicate. Hostage-taking is also a weapon of armed groups and criminals. You may immediately think of the 251 men, women and children who were violently abducted on the 7th of October 2023 by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. Speaking up for these hostages from Israel and more than 20 other countries does not undermine or silence other victims of the ensuing war in Gaza. It is beyond doubt that this conflict has been utterly devastating for Palestinian civilians, and my mandate is pursuing multiple allegations of torture and ill treatment of Palestinians in Israeli detention. At the same time, we must pursue justice for all victims who have been killed, injured, displaced, tortured and traumatized. The fate of many other hostages remains unknown. According to 2024 data, 82 of the girls abducted from schools in northern Nigeria by Boko Haram are still missing, and at least 30 humanitarian aid workers are being held by the Houthis in Yemen. Mr. Chair, my position is unequivocal. Hostage-taking is almost always a form of torture. The physical and psychological torment inflicted on hostages is severe and lasting. I interviewed more than 20 hostages, former hostages or family members for this report. Many spoke of rancid prison conditions and desperate isolation. Several spoke of beatings, starvation, humiliation, mock executions and sexual torture. Many were held in prolonged solitary confinement, in itself a form of torture after 15 consecutive days. They were cut off and left in darkness, starved of social contact and deprived of medical care. They suffered the constant fear of death and the unimaginable anguish of never being found or recovered. Several are still deeply traumatized by these experiences. Families are also victims, living in limbo, waiting for proof of life and release, trying to avoid financial ruin, having to make impossible decisions, with some even forced into silence by their governments. Children of hostages cannot comprehend what has happened. They experience sleeplessness, detachment, anxiety, and withdrawal. The hostages' ordeal is far from over if they are lucky enough to be released. Many suffer PTSD, chronic anxiety, and serious health issues that often require decades of rehabilitation. Some long-term detainees find that their jobs have gone, that their skills are outdated, they are in debt, and that their previous lives have simply disappeared. Mr. President, the report contains a comprehensive set of recommendations. 176 UN member states are party to the 1979 International Convention against the Taking of Hostages. That's nearly as many as you who are party to the Convention Against Torture. Yet the Hostages Convention is rarely mentioned. Despite clear international prohibitions, hostage-taking remains a low-risk, high-reward crime. To change this, perpetrators must be held accountable and punished harshly. I am requesting the International Criminal Court to step up investigations into hostage-taking. For those of you working on the draft international treaty on crimes against humanity, you must ensure that it is amended to include explicit reference to hostage-taking. Meanwhile, states should act to indict and prosecute hostage-takers for torture, as well as those who aid and abet them, including under universal jurisdiction. Families need better representation. It is shocking that there is no entity or person responsible within the UN to advocate for hostages or to represent their interests in negotiations. I ask the Secretary-General, with the support of UN member states, to appoint an SRSG on hostage-taking. I'm also asking governments to appoint senior hostage liaison officers to keep families informed and involved. Targeted sanctions, such as Magnitsky sanctions, should be deployed more rigorously against perpetrators. Confiscated assets and funds could be used to establish a UN hostage support fund. There must be more early warning mechanisms, prevention and monitoring, and more multilateral action. I encourage you to join and support Canada's initiative on arbitrary detention in state-to-state relations. Victims must see justice and be compensated and rehabilitated with long-term psychological, medical and financial support. They should be legally recognised as victims of torture. Distinguished delegates, hostage-taking is a cruel game in which innocents are the pawns. We cannot allow it to become an accepted tool of diplomacy or warfare. Disagreements, grievances and wars must be settled in accordance with the UN Charter and human rights and through dialogue. People's lives should never be used for political ends. Finally, Mr. Chair, all hostages, whomever they are, wherever they are, and by whomever they are being held, must be released unconditionally and immediately. Every state must play their part to make that happen. Mr. Chair, turning now to country visits. Je voudrais tout d'abord informer le
I would first like to inform the Council about the visit that I made to Senegal in February of this year, during which I was pleased to hear about the government's plans to improve prison facilities and conditions, most notably to address very serious levels of overcrowding. In short, I have encouraged them to take even bolder action.
Looking forward to undertaking my next country visits to Montenegro and Morocco, respectively. I now turn to the report of my country visit to Chile from 16 to 27 October 2023. I express my sincere gratitude to the government for the invitation and the exemplary cooperation. I am also grateful to many other stakeholders whom I met during the visit. For today's purposes, let me reinforce three key areas of recommendations of my report. First, I acknowledge that since the end of the military dictatorship over 30 years ago, Chile has made steady progress in the fields of transitional justice, institution building and human rights. Their commitment to a democratic and torture-free future is indeed impressive. Efforts have been made to hold accountable those responsible for human rights violations during the Pinochet era. However, many victims remain missing. Numerous cases are still pending, and a number of alleged perpetrators are yet to be brought to justice. I call on the government to expedite the adjudication of the remaining historic cases. Second, as Chile has embarked on this positive path, there have been setbacks. In particular, the social unrest Estallido Social in 2019 and the state's heavy-handed response to public demonstrations caused massive human rights violations. I heard many accounts from individuals who were injured, including permanent blindness, in particular because of the use of multiple projectile ammunitions deployed by law enforcement officers. I welcome that the Chilean police force is no longer using the 12 projectile rubber shot weapons used during the 2019 unrest. Crowd control weapons now in stock contain 3 projectiles. However, I emphasise that ammunition and launchers containing multiple projectiles should be decommissioned as they are inaccurate and pose a significant risk to bystanders. Only single-shot, non-lethal weapons are acceptable. I invite the government to consider joining the Alliance for Torture-Free Trade. The third and final issue to mention today is that I also assess the conditions and standards of treatment of persons deprived of liberty in a range of locations. Overcrowding and lack of rehabilitation opportunities were among the main challenges. In the facilities visited, whose infrastructure remains mostly outdated and in need of renovation or replacement, in some facilities, the space per person ratio was far below international standards and amounted to inhuman treatment. Mr. Chair, I look forward to continuing the constructive dialogue with the Government of Chile to support the implementation of my full set of recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Special Rapporteur. Now, according to our practice, we shall start by hearing the delegation of the country concerned by the report that has just been presented. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile. You have 5 minutes. You have the floor, ma'am.
Señor Vicepresidente.
Vice President, we're grateful to the Special Rapporteur for her visit to Chile and for the report presented to the Human Rights Council today. She highlighted the progress made in our country in combating torture and other cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment. And also, she has identified a number of pending challenges. First, the rapporteur recognises the efforts made in our country to prevent and combat torture after the end of the dictatorship. We are very mindful of our shortcomings, and we are pleased that the rapporteur has said that we are an example of transitional justice and policies in trying to build a state where we have the rule of law on the basis of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Similarly, we join in the recognition given by the rapporteur to the historic role played by civil society organisations, groups of victims and survivors and their family members in the search for truth, justice and reparation for violations of human rights. We're aware that the process of truth, accountability, has still not come to a conclusion. The plan launched in 2023, a year before the visit of the rapporteur, is an expression of this resolve. We still have cases that are before our courts in order to find the truth about what happened and establish accountability. Chile is grateful to the recommendations included in the report on these issues. However, the violations that have been left following the dictatorship is not alone. The events occurred in 2019 brought the country to address a number of reforms in order to deal with the use of police force, as well as to adopt measures for reparation and guarantees of non-repetition. Some of these have been referred to in the report. To this end, we are also mindful of the existence of a number of pending challenges that we hope to continue to tackle in a head-on way in the future. Mr. Vice President, Chile has been amending its normative framework to align itself with international standards in this area. With successive legal reforms and the establishment of a number of robust institutions to tackle torture prevention, we are striving to ensure that persons deprived of their liberty is a core concern in keeping with the rapporteur's report. We're pleased to see that, as it indicates in the report, they had full access to all places of deprivation of liberty that she wanted to visit, which is necessary to ensure that visits are conducted adequately and that the findings are representative of the national reality. There's no doubt that the context of deprivation of liberty is an area where there's great exposure or risk for torture and inhumane treatment. Therefore, we place special attention on the recommendations given by the Special Rapporteur in this area in order to make headway in creating safeguards that will help us to reduce these risks and ensure that we have appropriate accountability mechanisms in keeping with the requirements. To this end, we welcome the possibility of creating Mendes principles, for example, on effective mechanisms. Overcrowding in prisons is another challenge that our country, alongside others, is facing in the area of deprivation of liberty. On the basis of these legal reforms and the increase in the number of crimes, Chile has seen sustained increase in its prison population over the past number of years, which requires cautious analysis. Therefore, we are aware of the existing tensions between maintaining safety and security and also ensuring guarantees of deprivation of liberty in step with the dignity of every individual. We believe it is possible to progress in providing greater safety to the population whilst also adhering to international human rights requirements, including, of course, those who are convicted because of hostage-taking. We also are mindful of your recommendations on gender in prisons and the gaps that still exist in terms of gynecological care and access to female hygiene. In a country with a female-oriented exterior policy and mindful of the rights of LGBTQI+ persons, Chile will continue to strive to create dignified conditions for prison. Vice President, to conclude, I'd like to say that receiving and welcoming the Special Rapporteur was an honour for Chile, and we're grateful to her constructive attitude, both during the visit and after the visit. And President interrupts.
The list of speakers is now closed. I now invite interested delegations to ask questions of the Special Rapporteur and to make comments on her reports. The speaking time is 1 minute 30 seconds for all speakers. The first on my list is the delegation of European Union. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Madam Special Rapporteur, the EU would like to voice its firm appreciation and strong support to your work and to your mandate. We continue to condemn the use of torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment around the world. The position you are occupying was created exactly 40 years ago. Much progress has been achieved since, but unfortunately, we are not even close to eradicating torture, and hence your work remains as pertinent as ever. The EU expresses concern over the increased use of torture or ill treatment. We would like to highlight torture-free trade as a crucial step towards its full elimination and consider further steps to ban global trade in goods used for this purpose. You address the issue of hostage-taking as a form of torture and its increased use that demands collective international attention. We are also concerned about the rise in the number of arbitrary detentions in state-to-state relations. We further take note of the relative deceleration in the number of ratifications of the International Convention against the taking of hostages. Madam Special Rapporteur, in your view, what are the obstacles to the full implementation of the Convention, and what can states do to ensure its reinvigoration? I thank you.
Thank you, European Union. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Vice President. I have the honor to deliver a statement on behalf of the Lublin Triangle countries, Lithuania, Poland, and my own country, Ukraine. We express our deep appreciation to Special Rapporteur for unwavering efforts in the fight against torture. As we mark the 40th anniversary of this mandate, we need for a strong global response to torture has never been more urgent. We commend the report, which underscores that hostage-taking as an international unlawful act often accompanied by psychological and physical torture and other ill treatment. 4 years of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine have been marked by the widespread and systematic use of torture against civilians and POWs. It is Russia's coordinated policy that amounts to crime against humanity. Russia is reportedly holding over 15,000 Ukrainian civilian hostages, using them as leverage to exert pressure on Ukraine and to intimidate populations in temporarily occupied territories. For the most part, civilian hostages are held incommunicado, deprived of the opportunity to inform their loved ones about their whereabouts, as well as proper legal assistance. We call on the international community to take a firm stand against these egregious violations. Russia must be compelled to end the systematic use of torture, release all civilian detainees, and ensure their safe return to Ukraine. Those responsible must be brought to justice. I thank you.
Thank you, Ukraine. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Denmark on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Vice President. Special Rapporteur, I have the honor of speaking on behalf of the Nordic-Baltic countries. And let me first of all thank you for the tireless work you continue to invest in the global fight against torture and ill treatment. Last year we celebrated the 40th anniversary of the UN Convention Against Torture. And this year we mark the 40th anniversary of your mandate. One could have hoped for that your mandate would be redundant after 40 years, but unfortunately torture and ill treatment is still taking place across all regions of the world, and worrying trends continue. So your work continues and remains as important as ever. We commend you for focusing on the concerning practice of hostage taking in your latest report, noting the rise in the number of incidents of state hostage taking. These incidents undoubtedly lead both to severe physical and psychological damages for the hostages themselves and also for their relatives. Tailored support during the process of recovery and rehabilitation is needed, and we note your recommendation to share experiences among states on the services to be provided. And in this regard, could you share your views on the format and forum for such exchanges, and what can relevant actors such as states and international organizations do to facilitate such information sharing? I thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan on behalf of Organization of Islamic Cooperation.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The OIC Group has noted the Special Rapporteur's attention to the OPT and would have appreciated a more holistic approach. We are disappointed the report has sidestepped the plight of Palestinian hostages, many of whom have been incarcerated under conditions of torture for years. Our position on the events of 7 October 2023 and the hostages taken that day is clear, as reflected in HRC Resolution 55/28. For close to 8 decades, the Palestinian people and their inalienable rights have been held hostage by an illegal occupation regime. The use of the word detainees cannot and must not disguise the illegal occupation's long-standing practice of mass arbitrary detention of Palestinians over the course of 75 years. These Palestinian hostages are intended to coerce the people under occupation into submission. Their treatment is characterized by widespread and systematic abuse. We are dismayed also by the selective reading of the findings of the COI, which details widespread crimes of torture against Palestinians committed with the intent to inflict pain and suffering amounting to torture as a war crime and a crime against humanity. The very human dignity of the Palestinian people under occupation has been repeatedly trampled. They have faced dehumanization, oppression, torture, and genocide. We reiterate that the independence of the special procedures is a sacred trust bestowed by this Council and call for maintaining the highest standards of impartiality and good faith. I thank you.
Thank you, Pakistan. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kuwait.
شكرا سيدنا عبد الرئيس. يود وفد بلادي أن يضم صوته.
The delegation of my country aligns itself with the statement given from the Islamic group. We take note of the report from the Special Rapporteur of Torture. The Palestinian people are suffering from torture and other cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment. The physical and psychological torture of fear from the occupying power. This all needs to be reviewed through the report of the Special Rapporteur. We need to reveal the practices that have been used by the occupying power, because nobody is beyond the law. On a national level, we have taken steps to strengthen our normative framework to combat torture. We've published Decree 93 of 2024, amending the criminal law to ensure that it respects our international obligations. We have submitted our 4th report on the Convention Against Torture because we deeply believe in the principles enshrined in this convention. To conclude, our country underscores the importance of being impartial in preparing UN reports with a view to strengthening and promoting human rights. So thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you, Kuwait. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Czechia. You have the floor.
Madam Special Rapporteur, thank you for your report and all your work. We mark the 40 years of your mandate, but unfortunately the use of torture has not been eradicated. Once again, we express our concern about systematic and widespread use of torture by Russia on the occupied Ukrainian territories and in Russia. This was confirmed by the 3rd report of the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, submitted in October 2024 to the UN General Assembly. Many political prisoners from occupied Ukrainian territories face torture. Some of them have severe health problems and they are denied proper medical care, such as Ms. Mirina Danilovich and Mr. Ahmed Suleimanov from Crimea. Madam Special Rapporteur, we agree that hostage-taking involves form of torture. We support your call on states to criminalize all forms of hostage-taking. We studied with interest your call on the CAT to consider adopting a general comment on the topic, and we recognize the important role of the ICRC in hostage-taking situations, and we would like to know how do you consider your cooperation with the ICRC in general and occupied Ukrainian territories in particular. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias. A continuación.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Costa Rica, please. Thank you, Madam Vice President. My country is grateful to the Special Rapporteur for the reports, and in particular for noting that hostage-taking is not just a serious crime but a form of torture. We agree that the psychological and physical suffering due to prolonged capture and the inhuman conditions of detention and coercive oppression are tantamount to torture under international law. We'd highlight that hostage-taking is also conducted by states that continue to detain citizens under the jurisdiction or control under false or exaggerated accusations in order to promote foreign policy or other goals. Through manipulation of procedures and false narratives, these states prolong and complicate their release at the same time that they deny detainees the status of hostage, and this is unjustifiable. We agree with the rapporteur that it's not necessary for persons to be detained in an illegal or arbitrary way for them to be considered hostages. By contrast, persons whose detention could be legal, as is the case for persons who represent a threat to security, could then subsequently be used as hostages in order to force a third party to take action. Costa Rica appeals for rehabilitation and social reinsertion of those who have been released with a human rights approach. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I now recognise the representative of Malawi, please.
Madam Vice President, Malawi aligns with the statement of the African Group and welcomes this comprehensive report by the Special Rapporteur, in which she addresses the issue of hostage-taking from a perspective of absolute prohibition of torture and other cruel, inhumane and degrading treatment or punishment. We note with great concern that hostage-taking, perpetrated by both state and non-state actors, continues, and with it comes a wide range of human rights violations against children, pregnant women, the elderly, and persons with medical conditions. Such violations have resulted into severe and long-lasting physical and mental torture. Malawi maintains an absolute prohibition of torture, and is presently implementing recommendations from the CAT Committee following the review of our report. We will continue to work with the committee and the Special Rapporteur to address gaps in our anti-torture architecture. We concur with the Special Rapporteur by urging the international community to condemn all forms of hostage-taking and call upon member states to fully implement the provisions of the International Convention Against Taking of Hostages. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. And I recognise the representative of Morocco.
Je vous remercie, Madame la Vice-Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Our delegation thanks the Special Rapporteur for presenting the report, and we note the pertinence of the topic chosen. This issue is a form of torture, not just against the hostages themselves who were taken, but also their families. In compliance with the 2011 law and its international obligations, Morocco complies with a regime of preventing this kind of torture. We also have accountability before the law and measures for prevention. The law has greater penalties handed down where these violations are committed by people who are responsible for the care of the victims or have charge over them, as well as a number of other provisions. In line with the law on torture, impartial investigations must be opened against all allegations of torture, including those committed by civil servants as a part of their functions. Our ministries work closely with prevention mechanisms as a part of the monitoring of prisons. The law of Morocco allows for legal assistance for victims, as well as reparations for all forms of damage, moral, physical, and mental. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Switzerland has the floor, please.
Madame la Vice-Présidente.
Madam Vice President, Switzerland has made the fight against torture one of the priorities of its foreign policies. We strongly condemn the use of torture and other inhumane or degrading treatment, regardless of the perpetrators and the circumstances. Acts such as taking hostages and arbitrary detention can violate the absolute ban on torture and inhumane and humiliating treatment. Taking hostages is also a war crime under international humanitarian law. We are concerned by the growing practice of hostage-taking and by cases of forced disappearances and arbitrary detentions across the world. These violations and abuses committed by state and non-state actors are major attacks on international humanitarian law and human rights. No detainee should be used for political goals, and the families have the right to know the location and fate of their loved ones if they are detained. The ICRC and Switzerland have worked together to ensure that there is support for all persons deprived of their freedom. We urge all states to ensure accountability for all acts of torture. Perpetrators should be brought before the justice systems, and victims and their families have the right to justice, knowledge, and fair reparations. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the representative of Iraq.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. My country's delegation has noted the report of the Special Rapporteur. The report follows a politicized approach against the Palestinian people who have suffered for more than 16 months all possible forms of torture, including psychological torture, hunger, and the use of excessive force. Iraq itself suffers at the hands of Daesh terrorist groups. Iraqi citizens have fallen victim to attacks. We note also the publication of a law on Yazidi of 2021. The delegation of my country, to conclude, would like to pose the following question to the Special Rapporteur. What is the legal foundation for the recommendations in the report, notably the call to create national offices to provide support to families and respond to inquiries? We believe that this should be studied within the different UN agencies and all politicization should be avoided. Thank you.
A continuación.
Thank you. I now recognise the representative of Spain. Spain aligns itself with the statement from the European Union and thanks the Special Rapporteur for the presentation of the report. Prohibition of torture is absolute in all circumstances and unequivocally. We express our concern at the rising recourse to hostage-taking as a form of torture, both in conflicts that are raging, particularly in Gaza and Ukraine, as well as for political reasons in other contexts. Spain reaffirms its commitment to the International Convention on the Taking of Hostages, as well as the International Convention on Torture and Other Cruel and Human Degrading Treatments and its optional protocol, and will continue to support universalisation. We thank the OHCHR for drafting the handbook on training for presentation and follow-up of reports on torture. Internally, we continue to work to raise awareness, train and maintain a comprehensive vision of guarantee for the rights of persons deprived of their liberty through the NPM of the National Office for Guaranteeing the Human Rights of State Armed and Security Forces. Against the backdrop of the liquidity crisis in the UN, it's all the more important that special procedures, treaty bodies, the office and voluntary funds have sufficient financial support. Assistance to victims must be a priority. Madam Rapporteur, how can we bolster international support for the prevention and punishment of hostage-taking? I thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you. Next, I recognise the State of Palestine. Please go ahead.
Madam Vice President, once again, the report fails to provide a holistic and impartial account of torture. While the SR noted her visit to Palestine, she completely disregarded the suffering of the Palestinian people, selectively addressing human rights violations. For decades, the Palestinian people have endured a regime of occupation that uses mass arbitrary detention as a tool of coercion and control. The COI and other mandate holders have extensively documented that the illegal occupying power engage in widespread and systematic practices amounting to torture, a war crime and crime against humanity. Since October 7, 2023, as part of its genocidal campaign, thousands of Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank, including older persons, those with serious chronic illnesses, pregnant women, children and medical personnel, have been arbitrarily detained and transferred to Israel in a blatant violation of international law. Their names and whereabouts remain undisclosed. They are denied access to lawyers, and the ICRC has been completely barred from visiting them. The SR has rightfully recognized hostage-taking as a crime under international law, yet she fails to acknowledge that Israel is engaged in precisely this practice against Palestinian hostages. Since October 7, at least 60 Palestinians have died in Israeli custody, many due to torture. The UN itself has repeatedly documented Israel's use of starvation, sexual violence, rape, and beating as against Palestinian hostages. Yet the SR continues to downplay these findings. The dehumanization and systematic torture of Palestinians cannot be ignored or dismissed. Justice delayed is justice denied.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Zambia, please.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. My delegation thanks the rapporteur for her report and supports her recommendations in relation to hostage-taking and obligations highlighted to provide redress, including means of rehabilitation for victims of torture. Zambia also welcomes the report of the Secretary General on the United Nations Voluntary Fund for Victims of Torture. Indeed, hostage-taking occasions physical and mental torture. Madam Vice President, it is for this reason that more discussions are needed around awareness-raising strategies on the right to redress of victims of torture and enhancing visibility and support towards the United Nations Voluntary Fund for Victims of Torture. Further, the Special Rapporteur is encouraged to explore existing gaps in the international legal framework against hostage-taking, particularly around evolving forms of hostage-taking, to augment incorporating hostage-taking as an explicit offence in the draft articles on prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity. Madam Vice President, in an alarming global climate of shrinking civic space and waning state obligations, including towards compulsory norms and rights and obligations owed to all, it is imperative that our collective resolve towards accountability for the crime of torture and reparations or support to the victims of this crime do not get unhinged. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Indonesia.
Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Indonesia reaffirms its strong and principled stance against torture in all circumstances. As the state party to the UNCTAD, we continue to promote its universal ratification and full implementation. We take note of the Special Rapporteur's report, which highlights the severe impact of hostage-taking as a form of torture. We support the call to ensuring accountability for all perpetrators, whether state or non-state actors. However, the report lacks balance in its assessment. While it rightfully condemns hostage-taking by non-state actors, it fails to adequately address systematic and arbitrary detention without due process, particularly by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. Thousands of Palestinian civilians, including children, journalists, and political figures, remain detained indefinitely without formal charges, raising serious concerns under international humanitarian and human rights law. These Palestinian hostages are used as a means to pressure the occupied populations into submission, facing widespread and systematic abuse. We urge the Special Rapporteur to address this critical issue. We call for a more comprehensive and impartial approach to addressing all forms of hostage-taking and unlawful detention, ensuring that accountability applies universally without exception. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. And I recognize the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We look through the report of Special Rapporteur. While considering the importance of the topic itself, we are totally dismayed by the method of work used by the rapporteur and misusing the mandate for signal of some unrelated case. We are also dissatisfied for her ignores the comments and communication to her on the accusation level in her report, especially what mentioned in para 24 and 29. The reference in the context of the event of 5 decades ago, without addressing its historical context, many foreign interference and affiliated them, reflects lack of impartiality on the case related to Iran. Isolating such event without discussing its root cause is neither professional nor objective. While rejecting the content of the para 29 and consider it as erroneous and politically motivated claim, we reiterate that according to our legal proceeding, any committing offense will be tried with full legal rights and due process. Madam Vice President, it is so shocking that the rapporteur remains silent of Iranian detained by the U.S. or those facing extradition for allegedly circumventing unilateral sanction. If the detention of the certain foreign national is labeled hostage-taking, the same standard should be applied to the others. To conclude, we invite the Special Rapporteur to consider unilateral coercive measures, particularly by the United States, which have inflicted suffering, economic hardship, and violation of the right of the life of suffering people as a clear sample of widespread contemporary state correspond to torture.
Muchas gracias. A continuación.
Thank you very much. I now recognize North Macedonia.
Madam Vice President, North Macedonia thanks the Special Rapporteur for her insightful report on hostage-taking as a form of torture. The report presents alarming evidence of this practice being used as a tool of coercion, inflicting severe physical and psychological suffering in clear violation of international law. Hostage-taking by both state and non-state actors must be firmly condemned. It violates fundamental human rights, causes lasting trauma, and demands urgent international action. Strengthening legal protections, ensuring accountability, and providing comprehensive support to victims and their families are essential steps towards justice. The international community must remain vigilant and take decisive action against impunity. North Macedonia remains fully committed to the absolute prohibition of torture and urge all states to enhance cooperation in addressing hostage-taking, particularly in conflict and crisis situations. Madam Special Rapporteur, what further measures can be taken to reinforce international legal protections against hostage-taking as a form of torture? In conclusion, we reaffirm our strong support for the mandate of the Special Rapporteur and call upon all states to implement her recommendations without delay. I thank you.
Gracias. A continuación.
Thank you. And I recognize the representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. My delegation welcomes the report by the Special Rapporteur on the prevention of torture following the visit to Chile in the year 2023. My delegation deplores the incidents and scourge of torture in all geographic regions of the world. South Africa also recognizes that the prohibition of torture is a peremptory norm of international law and needs to be respected and upheld at all times under all circumstances. Accordingly, as a state party to the UN Convention on Prevention of Torture and the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, my delegation took a decision last December to formally designate the South African Human Rights Commission as South Africa's national preventive mechanism. This decision was made to ensure that South Africa fully complies with all SPT criteria for designation and notification of national prevention mechanisms. Madam Vice President, South Africa subscribes to the view that all human rights are universal, indivisible, interrelated, interdependent, and complementary to each other. For this reason, we reiterate the view that torture must be eliminated as a priority for humanity, as it is an assault on human dignity. In conclusion, my delegation fully supports the efforts of the Human Rights Council to expose any incidents of torture and commends countries and governments that have made similar efforts to comply with international law. I thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. And I recognize Egypt.
شكرا السيدة نائبة الرئيس.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. My delegation takes note of the report of the Special Rapporteur. As a member of the Convention on Hostage-Taking, we condemn all forms of kidnapping, arbitrary detention, and forced disappearances. The movement of people and the forced displacement of people are crimes under international law. It is vital that there is respect and compliance by the special procedures of their mandates. We note the approach adopted in this report focused on human rights and IHL. However, it is not fully balanced. The report does not mention the arrests and disappearances of Palestinians who were victims of inhumane and degrading treatment. The special procedures systems play an important role in encouraging countries to comply with their obligations. The special procedures themselves should respect their own code of conduct and the principles of neutrality and objectivity, which should allow better interaction with member states.
Palabra Bélgica.
I recognize Belgium.
Madame la rapporteure spéciale, la lutte contre...
Madam Special Rapporteur, the fight against torture and other inhumane and degrading torture continues in Belgium in compliance with our international obligations and the current laws, including the Initiative Human Rights 75. The Federal Parliament adopted in March 2024 a law preventing torture. The fifth UPR on torture is also being compiled. We thank you for the report on hostage-taking as a form of torture. It mentions the increased state hostage-taking over the past decades. Belgium condemns this phenomenon. We have also been confronted by this recently, however. Belgium shares your analysis, according to which hostage-taking is a form of torture and inhumane, cruel, and degrading treatment. The horror, mental and physical, suffered by hostages is unacceptable and has long-term consequences, including for hostages' loved ones and for society at large. Madam Special Rapporteur, do you recommend to states outreach and awareness-raising amongst the public on the risk of hostage-taking and the need to fight the criminal victimization across society? What are the best practices in this area? Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias. A continuación.
Thank you. And I recognize Albania.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Albania would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for her comprehensive briefing and for drawing the Council's attention to the need to deter and counter hostage-taking, which, as was stated in her report, constitute a threat to international peace and security. No one should be subjected to torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Enhanced international cooperation is needed to prevent, address and respond to cases of torture, ill treatment, and hostage-taking. Albania supports accountability measures for human rights violation, monitoring mechanism to promptly and thoroughly investigate acts of torture, as well as the protection of civilians in conflict zones. Albania condemns all acts of hostage-taking and calls on all actors, particularly in conflict situations, to fully protect and respect international law, international humanitarian law, and the Geneva Convention under all circumstances. Albania endorsed the Declaration Against Arbitrary Detention in State-to-State Relations to strengthen international cooperation and end the practice of arbitrary arrest, detention, on sentences for the purpose of leverage. Albania recognized the importance to support victims and their families by offering them the adequate and necessary support needed to recover. Madam Vice President, to conclude, I would like to commend the Special Rapporteur for her work and to express Albania's support for her mandate. I thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. And I recognize the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. My delegation expresses serious concern and completely rejects the report and allegations made by Special Rapporteur, as she asserts unsubstantiated and unfounded data about our country. She is blindly following the impure moves of hostile forces of the DPRK to undermine our dignified social system, which enjoys the people's absolute support and trust, and also to mislead the international perception, which cannot be condoned or tolerated. The report listed the developing countries one after another, but made no mention of the United States or Western countries. This practice adds to the global acknowledgement that the UN human rights mechanisms are being turned into the political tools for certain privileged forces, and is a serious violation of principles of universality, objectivity, non-selectivity, and non-politicization. As in the report, the fact that none accepted her country visit during 2024 clearly indicates their stance towards her. The Special Rapporteur is urged to fulfill her duty in a fair and objective manner in compliance with the Code of Conduct and the principles of respect for national sovereignty and non-interference in internal affairs of the state. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to Nigeria.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Nigeria thanks the Special Rapporteur and shares our deep concerns on the global rise in hostage-taking and the severe psychological and physical torture suffered by hostages. The enduring impact of these acts is a reality Nigeria knows too well, as the country continues to suffer the devastating consequences of terrorism and hostage-taking, with non-state actors targeting soft targets. The 2014 Chibok schoolgirls' abduction remains a lingering wound, especially with some victims still in captivity. The calamitous effect of hostage-taking extends far beyond individuals. It impacts families, communities, and the country at large. Despite these tragedies, Nigeria remains resolute in its commitment to ending hostage-taking and terrorism. Our legal framework, including the Terrorism Prevention and Prohibition Act of 2022, explicitly criminalizes hostage-taking and provides a comprehensive structure for prevention, prosecution, and punishment. Nigeria also reinforced its commitment to safeguarding educational institutions by endorsing the Safe Schools Declaration, an initiative launched after the Chibok abductions to enhance school security and prevent further attacks. Furthermore, through psychosocial support, medical care, and educational reintegration programs, the government and humanitarian partners help survivors rebuild their lives. Finally, Madam Special Rapporteur, how can international cooperation be strengthened to support national efforts in preventing hostage-taking? I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. And I recognize Maldives.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. My delegation thanks the Special Rapporteur for her comprehensive and insightful report. We welcome the Special Rapporteur's visit to Ramallah to meet with Palestinian victims of torture. Madam Vice President, the Maldives agrees with the Special Rapporteur that the act of arbitrary detention for leveraging is also a form of hostage-taking and causes immense pain and suffering to the individual, to the family, and the society as a whole. We recognize the plight of countless Palestinians that have been taken hostage by successive Israeli governments, and a majority of these Palestinian hostages have never been convicted of a crime, including those held in arbitrary detention without charge or trial. The Maldives strongly condemns the acts of Israeli authorities who are utilizing arbitrary and unlawful detention as a method of hostage-taking to support the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their homeland. We call on Israel to release all persons in administrative detention without charge or trial and to respect international humanitarian law and the basic human rights of these persons. Madam Vice President, the Maldivian government remains steadfast in its commitment to combating torture. To conclude, we would like to hear the views of the Special Rapporteur on what member states can do to alleviate the suffering of Palestinian hostages held under Israeli arbitrary detention. I thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. And I'll give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Brazil thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report. We share the concern with the rise of incidents of state hostage-taking, alongside the continued prevalence of non-state hostage-taking, which demand collective international attention. Hostage-taking requires a multidisciplinary approach. It can be recognized as a form of torture, but also of enforced disappearance and arbitrary detention. Its reported rise points to the erosion of respect for international human rights and humanitarian law, which calls for firm action from this Council. In Gaza, Brazil has consistently condemned the abduction of hostages by Hamas and other armed groups, and has demanded their immediate and unconditional release, as well as humanitarian access to them. Brazil has also condemned Israel's disproportionate reaction, which has so far deprived of life more than 47,000 Palestinians. All parties to the conflict are bound by international human rights and humanitarian law. We reiterate our commitment to fight and prevent all forms of torture and ill treatment. We are pleased to note that we are approaching universal ratification of the Convention Against Torture with strong support from Latin American countries. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. And I'll give the floor to Ghana.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. My delegation thanks the Special Rapporteur for her comprehensive report. In the face of global human rights threats and major humanitarian crises, the prohibition of torture remains crucial. We believe that torture is both ethically unacceptable and ineffective in achieving legitimate security goals. Madam Vice President, Article 15, Clause 2b of our Constitution explicitly states that no person shall, whether or not he is arrested, restricted, or detained, be subjected to any other condition that detracts or is likely to detract from his dignity and worth as a human being. In this regard, my delegation concurs with the Special Rapporteur's recommendation that states permit access for independent monitors to all places where individuals are held hostage or deprived of their liberty. This will help reveal the suffering of hostages and ensure their psychological and physiological needs are properly addressed. Madam Vice President, as a country that has ratified the UN Convention Against Torture, its optional protocol, and as a member of the Convention Against Torture Initiative, Ghana strongly condemns all forms of torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment around the world. I thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. And I'll give the floor to the Ambassador of Colombia. Thank you, Madam Vice President. 40 years on from the creation of the Special Procedure on Torture, I'd like to reiterate the support of Colombia to this mandate and express my gratitude for the work that you, Madam Rapporteur, and your predecessors have completed. Allow me also to express my gratitude for the report presented in the Council that addresses hostage-taking as a form of counsel. As you rightly say, kidnapping and hostage-taking are atrocious crimes that undermine human dignity and the fundamental principles of international law. These acts generate not just physical and psychological suffering that is devastating for victims, but they also deeply affect their families and communities and leave irreparable harm within the social fabric. Kidnapping is one of the manifestations of violence and torture lived and experienced by Colombians as part of the internal conflict. In order to strengthen mechanisms for memory, justice and non-repetition, currently the Congress is studying a draft bill on the public report of those kidnapped. The eradication of kidnapping and torture is a moral imperative that requires decisive action. Thus, I'd like to highlight the importance of the adoption of Act 2371 of 2024, through which Colombia ratified the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, Degrading Treatment. The Constitutional Court should soon issue a sentence on its constitutionality in order to bring it into force. We are taking this decisive step within our legislation to reaffirm the commitment of Colombia against torture. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. This was the final speaker that we could accommodate. Excellencies, esteemed participants, this brings us to the end of this meeting. We will meet again this afternoon at 2:30 to continue the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. This will be followed by the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. I hereby close the 14th meeting of the 58th session of the Human Rights Council.